This is all fine. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 51, which I have called Joseph Chamberlain Empire Man, because that's the main part of Chamberlain's story that I know a fair bit about. But I'm lucky enough to have Arron Hook with me this evening, who is the big expert on my Discord on British 19th and early 20th century politics. And I know Aaron's just read a biography of Joseph Chamberlain, so the first half of the stream is mostly going to be Aaron. And I'm sure I'm going to learn some stuff, and I'm quite looking forward to that. But as always, to give people time to join the stream, etc., I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made vain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for all the sword, what's love and heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye good, the cry of those ye humor, are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years, no edge
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. If you like good music, go and check out Chris Gard's channel on YouTube. And you can also follow him on X, Twitter, where we are also live. Okay, I found out only today, actually, that Joseph Chamberlain was actually born in the same London borough as my father and grandfather. He was born in Camberwell, in quite a nice little road there, which is still quite a nice little road there, believe it or not. But it's also got a huge non-conformist trap chapel in it, which is a very nice building. And on that point, I'm going to hand it over to Arron James Hook. Take it away, Arron.
Oh, thank you, Duke. Just before we go on, I have got one picture just to show. Let me just put this up, just so that people can have an idea of who we're talking about. Well, that should be there. I think you'll. There we go. So this is, ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Chamberlain, who was once described by Winston Churchill in his book Great Contemporaries as the man who made the political weather, and he most definitely did. Not merely his probably two most famous campaigns of opposing Irish Home Rule and advocating tariff reform in the Imperial Federation, but from the very start of his career. So just to give you a bit of background on Chamberlain himself, he was born in, as Duke said, in Camberwell, in London in 1836. His father and uncle are involved in screw making. They are a part of a firm called Nettleford and Chamberlain. And he is very much involved in the early part of his life in that. His family are Unitarians, something which remains with him until his married life, where the death of his two of his three wives caused him to lose his faith. He very much the first roughly 30 years of his life, he is very much a businessman. He's not necessarily overly involved in politics. He's more involved in sort of making a living and having a family. So his first wife, who he married in 1861, and she.
Arron, can I ask you, mate? Just for the audience,
yeah.
To clarify, he's very much a middle class chap. He's not wealthy. He's not an aristocrat. He's not poor at all. He's quite well off, but very much a middle class guy rather than part of the aristocracy. I think that would be correct. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Chamberlain was the first self-made politician in Britain, or at least is the first really prominent one. After Chamberlain, you get other self-made politicians, but before him, they're generally not. They don't. If they do exist, so John Bright, Richard Cobbett. They are prominent campaigners and prominent MPs, but they don't reach the same heights as Chamberlain does, both in the Liberal Party and then in the Unionist Party during the 1890s and the early Edwardian era. And so the Nettleford and Chamberlain, the firm, are operating in Birmingham. Now Chamberlain has some family links there. His mother's family are from Birmingham, so he goes up there. And he gets involved through sort of the social aspect of meeting his wife's family. His wife's family were the Kendricks, who were Hollowware manufacturers in Edgbaston, and they are Unitarian, liberals. They're very much involved in social reform, municipal. As a Chamberlain becomes involved for the first time in politics in sort of the late 1860s, where he is campaigning for national education. And what he's arguing at the time, there was a big debate, and this will continue well into the early 20th century, between those who wanted non-sectarian education, sort of compulsory education for people, for children, and those who wanted this to be sort of Anglican-led compulsory education. And Chamberlain, coming from a non-conformist background, was very much in favour of the non-Anglican-led. So he helps found an organisation called the Birmingham Education League, which then becomes the National Education League, campaigning for non-sectarian universal education, which is paid for, which is controlled by an elected local government board in every sort of borough and city, instead of being controlled by a local Anglican church. And this is where Chamberlain really does come to the fore for the first time. He's very much the leader of this campaign. He's seen as a public face of it, and also pretty much a public face of Birmingham. His campaigning speeches are very well regarded, and they very much gin up the supporters of the League and for non-sectarian education. And this brings him to the the attention of the Liberal Party nationally, particularly Gladstone, and he is regarded as a rising star within Birmingham politics because of this. Now, even as he is campaigning on the issue of education, the issue that will sort of be the defining issue of his career, Ireland, is very much on his mind. To sort of put a pause here on Chamberlain's career, because we need to go to the issue of Irish Home Rule, which will shortly become the dominant issue in his career. Irish Home Rule, to give the short version, you have Ireland from roughly the 12th century up until 1801 was a separate kingdom from England. It has its own parliament, which is established around the same time as the English Parliament. However, you have, at the end of the 18th century, you have the United Irishman Revolt, which is an Irish Republican revolt trying to create an independent Ireland. It is suppressed, and the British government decides that the way to ensure this does not occur in future is to have an act of union.
Arron, can I just say to people who watch this now and who watch it in the future, if you want to hear more on the Irish Home Rule stuff, I did a stream with Arron on this channel, which you can easily find, which goes into much greater detail about this stuff.
Yeah, and so the Act of Union is passed. When the Act of Union is passed, it is passed with promises with Catholic emancipation. For various reasons, that doesn't come about, and that means that in the 1820s, after the Independent Wars, you have a gentleman called Daniel O'Connell, who is an Irish MP. He campaigns on two issues. One is Catholic emancipation. The other is the restoration of the Dublin Parliament. He gets Catholic emancipation, but the Dublin Parliament he does not achieve before his death in the late 1840s or early 1850s. Now, the Irish Home Rule issue at that point sort of it goes fallow. But one thing that should be pointed out is that until the 1880s, the objective of Irish Home Rule is solely legislative independence for domestic affairs in Dublin. In Ireland, there's not it is not a campaign, at least by the leadership, for a separation from Britain completely to become an independent country. That you should keep in mind for what's coming next with Chamberlain, because
it was much more like devolution, Arron. Like in terms of like the Scottish and Welsh parliaments today. That was the original idea of it, but just like those devolved parliaments, it has the effect of dividing. Of course, it does.
Yeah, and now in the late 1860s, you had what were called the Fenian outrages, which is where the Fenians had carried out a dynamiting campaign on the British mainland, and there would be both in 1866 and then through the late 1860s, an attempt by Fenians, Irish American Fenians who were veterans of the American Civil War, to launch raids into Canada. And so you had the Irish Home Rule issue, after going fallow from the sort of late 1840s, starts to revive again. Now, the man who was leading at this time is a chap called Isaac Butt. Now, Butt's interesting, where O'Connell was a Catholic, Butt is a Protestant, he's a Conservative, and he's very much somebody who wants Ireland to remain a part of the British Empire. But because of his experience of the Irish famine, he thinks that for him, watching it as an academic in Dublin, he thinks the issue there came from the fact that that London was having to react to what was going on in Ireland, and that caused the trouble, the sort of delays and the increase in misery, and that if Ireland was administered with legislative independence from Dublin, something like the famine wouldn't happen again, or if it did happen, it could be dealt with far more quickly and not become the crisis it became. And so Butt is arguing for a restoration of the Dublin Parliament. However, he is also arguing, interestingly, for a federalisation of the British Isles, so that you would have parliaments at the same time in Scotland, for example, and in Wales, and this would mean whilst keeping the Westminster Parliament. And this is an idea that Chamberlain is very much interested in, because he can see that the issue Ireland is starting to become an issue because of the Fenian attacks on the growing establishment of the what is known as the Home Rule League, and then the Home Rule Association, which then becomes the Irish Parliamentary Party. And so he thinks that if Ireland is going to get some form of self-government, legislative independence, it needs to be in a framework of a complete federalisation of the British Constitution, modelled on that of the United States.
He does change his mind about this later, though, Arron. Yes.
Yeah, yes, very much so. So this is his attitude. I'm just mentioning this so that when we come to the actually Gladstone and Home Rule and Chamberlain, you can sort of see where Chamberlain gets to. So throughout the 1870s and into the early 1880s, this is his sort of attitude. He thinks that, right, if we're going to deal with Ireland and the issues of Ireland, and if the Irish want a degree of self-government, it needs to be in a framework of sort of an overall federalised Britain. I'll come to why he comes to a change of mind to that later. Now, at the same time, Chamberlain has, because of his sort of rising fame and success with the Education League, which was part of which its success is because of the passage of the National Education Act 1870, which is still to this day the foundation of all educational legislation in this country. And he is then put forward as the mayor of Birmingham, as a Liberal candidate for the mayor of Birmingham, and he succeeds in winning it. And his time as mayor of Birmingham is important for two things. One, he fundamentally changes the city. It is Chamberlain's mayoralty that makes the city into the second city of Britain. And particularly the creation of Corporation Street, which becomes the beating heart of Birmingham's commercial and financial. It becomes Birmingham's commercial and financial beating heart and turns into the sort of great powerhouse it becomes. The second thing that it does is it helps Chamberlain start to establish what becomes known as the Birmingham Caucus. This is effectively a political machine that will dominate Birmingham right up until 1945. So this is a machine that far outlives Chamberlain's own lifetime and that of his sons. And,
Arron, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but can I just say again for the audience watching this, and this is particularly true for anyone who's from overseas, who's not British, but really just for anyone these days, Birmingham in the 19th century was a great industrial city of Britain. These days it's known for mass third-world immigration and all sorts of bad things. But in the 19th century, it was really the beating heart of industrial Britain. Very, very important and very, very different to what it's like today. So, yeah, sorry, Arron.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right, Duke. And for example, to back up the point, one of the, when the British Army has its rifles made, one of the main sort of manufacturer of them in terms of its political manufacturing is at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. But the other place is always a production centre for rifles for the British Army is Birmingham Small Arms, and another one is many of you know have seen westerns, and all the Indians have got the tomahawks. Well, many of those in the 19th century had the words "Made in Birmingham" printed on them.
Not only tomahawks, Arron, but Bowie knives. Many of the Bowie knives used in the American West were made in Birmingham. Yeah. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, and just to, oh, sorry, William, you can say something.
No, I was muting myself. I'm sorry, Arron. Can I also say good evening to William Grenville? William, if you've got something to say, do just interrupt.
Yeah, it's actually quite an interesting family connection here because my grandfather's grandfather was they were ceramics. They were in Staffordshire, and particularly Stoke-on-Trent, where they had their factories, and they were at this time members of the Liberal Party and very much involved in like health review boards, particularly that of residential, like the slums, the terrace houses, slums, and all that.
I'm sure Arron's going to talk about that because Joseph Chamberlain was, he's already mentioned, was a great reforming mayor of Birmingham. But also, Arron mentioned earlier before you joined us, William, that the family that he married into, they made hollowware. And for anyone who doesn't know, hollowware is like basically it's metal stuff mostly, and it's things like coffee pots, sugar bowls, butter dishes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and it's quite funny because there's public record of on the Stoke-on-Trent. There's like a website which talks about like the history of these um, the ceramics company, and that was in the family, and they were very much a big followers of Joseph Chamberlain at that time, to such an extent that they then would go on to join the Liberal Unionist Party, and then eventually become Conservative Party members, even standing in elections. Bearing in mind, this is at a time where the Conservative, they wouldn't win, in these seats. In this is going like into the 30s, 40s, and stuff in Stoke and everything, because of course that would become a Labour Party heartland.
Arron, when did what year did Joseph Chamberlain become the mayor of Birmingham?
Just bear with a second, just get that.
1873, I believe.
Yes, yeah, and he was there for, I think he left in 76, I think it was. Yes, he was there for 3 years. I think it was they had a term limit that you couldn't run more than once. Sorry.
I was just going to say, during the campaign, he sort of coined the term "the people above the priest," which was he was attacking the high church Tory opponents, because of course he was one thing about him was he was a sort of a very big proponent of disestablishmentarianism, particularly again with the Church of England. And what was he? Was he
He was a Unitarian.
Unitarian, I thought so. Yeah. And it's quite funny because my family they were Methodists, and mix of Methodists and then Baptist. So again, they weren't part of the church, the mainline Church of England, which was at that time was the Tory party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, just on what you said, William, about your the loyalty of your family members to Chamberlain, that was absolutely true. Not just for people who ended up in sort of standing for the Tories in the West Midlands and in Birmingham. That was true for the voters. In the 1930s, there were numerous occasions where Labour activists were going around campaigning in the general elections in the 30s and the local elections, and they were informed in uncertain terms that they were going to this voter in question was going to be voting Conservative because his family had been voting for the Conservatives because of Joseph Chamberlain, and their loyalty was very much to the Conservatives because of Joe Chamberlain. And so that sort of influence of Chamberlain in Birmingham, as I mentioned a bit earlier, it continued right up until essentially the 1945 general election. So Chamberlain's legacy in Birmingham was considerable, and it really does begin during this time as mayor, where he mentioned the slum clearances and some sort of social reform that William mentioned in Stoke-on-Trent. That was very much one of the reasons why the sort of clearances that made Corporation Street happen, was that Chamberlain wanted to improve the lives of people living there, because that area was a slum essentially.
And it's quite and what's quite interesting is, of course they probably wouldn't agree with the famous sage of Chelsea, Thomas Carlyle. But Thomas Carlyle, many of his pamphlets talked about how these particular because what's these sorts of titans of industry, as the phrase goes. So like my family, well, they were factory owners, so technically they were part of the new the sort of new class of barons, you could say. They're like a sort of at that time the industrial age barons, that had sway over a local area. And the argument was that they should actually behave in that way because, like a lord and his fiefdom. And in some interesting way, I mean, this is kind of what. And I don't know if you have you mentioned the Birmingham Gaslight and Coke Company and the Birmingham Staffordshire Gaslight
Not
Company?
yet.
Yeah. Okay. But when you get onto that, you'll see that in some ways Chamberlain actually I don't know if he deliberately, but he sort of comes to that conclusion that Carlyle was taught. They're both on the same page, but they're coming at two different perspectives, I think, on this.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when Chamberlain does that with the gas and water, it's very much because he regards that the system as it exists, especially the competition you have between the gas companies, he sort of utterly, it's completely not working, and it's not providing anything for the people who live in Birmingham. It's essentially that it's far better if we control it, and then we can just make sure the whole thing gets worked out than it is in the hand of these two companies. And it's interesting that he very much makes the case that whilst this will in the end make a profit, the object is not necessarily to make a profit, it's to make sure that people get what they need, that the city has a responsibility to provide, and that the people in charge have a responsibility to provide good services to the people of Birmingham, whether they are elected or not.
I think it's fair to say, and Arron, you can tell me this, that Joseph Chamberlain started off as a radical liberal before he became an imperialist liberal.
I think he was probably essentially both. His sort of radical social reform didn't disappear when he sort of moved over, and he was very much imperial minded even during the 1870s. So I think it's not so much he changed from one to the other; they sort of mature together, if that makes sense.
They complemented each other. Yeah, fair enough. Because one of the things I noticed with my background reading about Joseph Chamberlain is that he, for all through his life, I mean, in some ways, he's the father of the county council system in Britain.
Yes.
That until recently was still the main way the country was locally governed. But he was also very much, as has already been mentioned, he was very much for clearing slum areas, for making the sewage works work properly, the gas work properly, this kind of stuff, and providing everyone with clean water, which was safe. There again, although this is jumping ahead a little bit, he eventually becomes president of the Board of Trade. He did quite a lot to make British merchant ships safer for British sailors to serve on. The British merchant marine in those days was by far the biggest in the world. But there were some fairly dodgy practices of private ship owners that Chamberlain was very much against. For example, there were things called coffin ships that were very liable to sink. And what would happen is that the ship owners would vastly over-insure them and then hope they sank, which of course wasn't very healthy if you were one of the crew, So Chamberlain did quite a lot of work against that sort of stuff. He later on, he brought in the first Workers' Compensation Act, which actually carried on until after World War II, so that if you were working in a factory, for example, and you had an accident, you would get some compensation, and he made the employers pay for that, by the way. But yeah, so he was very much, he did a lot to improve the lives of ordinary working people.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that when he's doing this, at the time, the Conservatives are in power from 1874 to 1880, and he's working with under Benjamin Disraeli. And Chamberlain finds that he can work with the Conservatives. Obviously, he is a liberal and a radical liberal, and he's opposed to the Conservatives in Birmingham. In fact, because of his sort of municipal reforms and his municipalisation of gas and water, he gets accused of practising gas and water socialism by the Birmingham Tories. But at Westminster, he's able to more than easily work with Disraeli's ministers when it comes to social reform, and when it comes to particularly sort of replacing the slums with what's known as artisan housing. And this is important because it puts in the back of Chamberlain's mind that the Tories are people who, yes, they're opponents, but they are people who you can work with when need be, or if the occasion rises for a particular issue where you can unite with them to defeat it. and that I think people need to remember for what happened in 1885, 1886. So Chamberlain is regarded as rightly as a great mayor of Birmingham, and he has built up as mayor of Birmingham at this sort of a political base, which he's then able to use combined with sort of the political base he built up through his campaign for the National Education League to get selected and elected as a member of Parliament in one of the Birmingham seats, which is in 1875 or 76, 76, sorry. And he then spent from 1876 to 1880 sort of making a name of himself on the backbench as a sort of radical campaigner, and he sort of builds up his support in Birmingham into it being known as the Birmingham Caucus. And then in 1880, he helped in the, I can't remember if it's 1880, but it's either in the late 1880s or early 1870s, early 1890s. Late 1870s or early 1880, he establishes the National Liberal Federation, which is a sort of national organisation for all the liberal associations. And so he's essentially created a huge organisation to bring in sort of national coordination for the Liberal Party. And this is put into great effect when the general election of that year comes in 1880, because the Liberals then win. And Gladstone is very, very, very grateful to Chamberlain because of his organisational expertise, and also he's able to deliver most of Birmingham to the Liberals. And as a consequence, Chamberlain, having only been an MP for 4 years, gets appointed to Gladstone's cabinet as president of the Board of Trade. However, at the time, throughout this government, the colonial secretary was in the House of Lords, and so Chamberlain becomes the colonial spokesman for the government in the Commons. And that means that though the Board of Trade is a ministerial post outside the cabinet, usually at this point, Chamberlain is included in the cabinet, and so he has a considerable amount of influence in there because of being both president of the Board of Trade and especially.
This is this just for the audience again. This is when Chamberlain is doing stuff to make British merchant ships safer and all this, because that comes under the Board of Trade in those days.
And he had a history as well. Before the election, under the Disraeli government, he supported the purchase of the Suez Canal Company, as well as he criticised. I mean, he did criticise the government's. I think it was like the Afghan War, the Second Afghan War, and Zulu War thing. But he was very much, he wasn't like an anti-imperialist, like or Little Englander sort of person. He did actually see the importance of protecting.
Yeah, you missed that, William, because you joined us a little bit late.
Right.
That Arron had made the point that whilst he was always in favour of improving the lot of the working class in England, he was also always somewhat of an imperialist.
Yeah, it was. It's a sense of duty, isn't it? Because and it's quite funny because he would be accused of being like an anarchist, Republican, atheist. Yeah, he would have the whole thing because of his radical stances and everything. But I mean, the thing that is with his actions on that, he did see the importance of Britain remaining dominant, in control, particularly with the Suez Canal Company, which trade-wise, incredibly important. I mean,
I will just say, William, I talked to Arron a little bit about this stream before we started, and it's going to be a stream of two halves. And so the first half of this stream is going to be mostly domestic politics. And in the second half, we're going to talk about stuff that you're talking about now. We're going to talk much more about Chamberlain's imperial vision and this kind of stuff. But this first half of the stream is mostly going to be the internal politics of Britain and Chamberlain's stuff on that. And so I'm very conscious that I want to let Arron fill us in on that stuff, because he knows a lot more than that than I do, certainly. But anyway.
Yeah, and one thing that Chamberlain does as president of the Board of Trade is he oversees a trade treaty with France. Now, this is somewhat there's an irony to this because it's a free trade treaty, and he is criticised by the Conservatives for advocating it. And the chief critic of Chamberlain in this is a chap called C.T. Ritchie, who 20 years later is the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Arthur Balfour, who is Chamberlain's chief opponent against over the issue of tariff reform. So Ritchie, over the course of
I know about Ritchie, Alan. Arron, I know about Ritchie. He's Scots guy, and he was an arse later on. He really was.
But just the irony of the fact that you've got that they essentially on that one issue over the French over on trade seem to do a switch over the course of 20 years, and this actually is I can explain why that happens sort of later on, but I'll stop a moment just to discuss Irish Home Rule. Because the Home Rule has changed somewhat. Because throughout the 1870s, the man leading it is obviously Isaac Butt. He's arguing for the idea of a Irish legislative independence within a federal Britain, and he has become very much become seen as out of date by sort of the younger, up and coming Irish Home Rulers, particularly people like Parnell. Even though Parnell personally has a great deal of personal admiration for Butt, he really does like the man. But Butt does not believe that the policy of what's known as obstructionism, which is where Irish MPs will cause enough trouble in the House of Commons to force a debate to end, to try and force the government to bring Irish matters to the fore, is not a way to do things. A famous example of this is actually in December 1878, where there is a debate on the Second Afghan War, and the younger MPs, Irish Parliamentary Party MPs, are sort of calling for an act of obstructionism during this debate. And Butt turns around and tells them, no, we're not going to do that because this is important to the security of the British Empire. And this is the sort of thing that makes the younger MPs, particularly Parnell, decide, right, he's got to go, despite the fact that Parnell really does like the man. In fact, later on says it's the worst thing he ever had to do in his life to get Butt out of the leadership. But Butt is removed late 1879, 1880, and then Parnell becomes the leader. And Parnell is a lot more hardline. He very much sees with O'Connell and Butt. The idea is that Ireland will be legislatively independent domestically, but will still keep the British crown and will still be very much a part of the empire. For somebody like Parnell, it is very much Home Rule is a stepping stone to full independence, and so Parnell is, and he is in his terms of as purely as a politician and a statesman, he is brilliant. He is one of the best leaders the Irish Home Rule movement ever had. He is a great speaker. He can manage men, and he can very much bring the movement to a fore. They did not know. They were purely just trade treaties, commercial treaties. They had no immigration connected with them. But with Parnell, he is very much turning the Irish Parliamentary Party into a very active force, both in Parliament and outside it. And this is forcing the Conservatives and the Liberals to properly face the idea of Home Rule and how they will react to it. And Gladstone comes to the view of seeing Home Rule as necessary. The Conservatives are opposed to it. And now, within the Liberal Party, there is a spectrum of opinion. We've got people who are very much supportive of Home Rule alongside Gladstone, who they very much think it is the solution. There's people like Chamberlain who think, okay, at this point, okay, we can have Home Rule, but it has to be within a federal system. And then you've got people like the future Duke of Devonshire, then Lord Hartington, who is adamantly opposed to it. In his case, he has a very personal reason for opposing it, because in 1881 or 1882, his younger brother is the Chief Secretary in Ireland, and he is stabbed to death in Phoenix Park, along with the most senior civil servant in Ireland. by a group called the Irish Invincibles.
They were not just stabbed to death; they were absolutely butchered in Phoenix Park. But yes.
Yeah, and so
Yeah, and you, of course, the Tory party, the Protestant landowning class, particularly Protestants in Ulster,
yes,
of course, were entirely against home rule. I mean, and that would be the theme during the Irish Wars of Independence and everything, and the creation of Northern Ireland. But
And one of the things to remember also about 19th century Ireland is that if the British had anything like the Prussian Junker class, it was the Anglo-Protestants of Ireland. If you look up a list of great British generals and senior military officers and what have you, an enormous number of them were Anglo-Protestants. Lots.
yeah, and one of the interesting things about Chamberlain is that in the 1870s, when he's thinking this, when he's coming to the idea of okay, we can have a Irish solution of independence within a federal sort of British framework. He makes the point that if that happens, there's probably going to have to be a separate parliament for Ulster. Ulster's interest was separate from the South. And so it's interesting that this is pretty much 10 years to 15 years before Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, is in Belfast at the City Hall, and he gives a speech where he gives the famous Unionist rally cry of Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. So it's interesting that Chamberlain is thinking about these things long before they are coming to the fore in terms of major sort of frontline British politics.
it's also quite interesting in 1880, around like early 1880s, was the revival of the Orange Order on the backdrop of all of this, because the Orange Order wasn't it sort of fell out of fashion in some regards, because there were, I mean, the and this is where I think people get a bit confused. At this particular point, maybe you could say after the or during the Napoleonic Wars and after, the Irish Catholic and Protestants weren't that divided. There wasn't like this sort of vengeful hatred stuff that, going back to Cromwell, the Commonwealth period. But what you had at this point was like the battle lines were being drawn, because of course the Home Rule was backed by the largely Irish Catholics, and this encouraged a revival of the Orange Order.
It was, to be fair, William, it was pretty divided around the time of the United Irishmen, which Arron has already talked about. The local yeomanry cavalry in Ireland, who were mainly responsible for putting down the United Irishmen, some of whom were Protestants, by the way, but the people responsible for putting that down were mainly Orangemen, and this is during the Revolutionary War period. So, yeah.
But the thing there is, even during the Easter Rising, the like paramilitary nature of Irish nationalism was a minority.
William, absolutely, and Arron and I were talking about this just before we went live. But again, we're jumping well ahead. We're still in the 1870s, early 1880s. So maybe in due course we'll cover that stuff. Okay.
Yeah, and so Chamberlain is sort of, his view of Home Rule is starting to evolve. He hasn't got to the yet. It isn't until 1885, 1886 that he sort of rejects the idea of federal Britain, and therefore comes to the view that we can't have Home Rule. But he is very much willing to engage with the Home Rule on particular issues. So, for example, you mentioned previously before, Duke, about how he's very much involved in advocating local government. He very much argues that we can extend the local government that we have in England and Wales and Scotland should very much be extended to Ireland. And in fact, he thinks this might be one way of sort of neutralising Home Rule. That if the Irish are able to control their local affairs through local government, that will sort of remove the need for Home Rule. That's a bit naive, but he's clearly unlike some politicians, clearly willing to engage with the Home Rulers in trying to deal with issues in Ireland. Another one is land reform. That is a big sort of campaigning issue for the Irish Home Rulers. And he very much, being a sort of social reformer, can see that as something that's entirely legitimate, and he very much sort of helps get a land bill passed, which helps with tenants throughout the during this government.
Am I right in saying, Arron, that at one stage I think it was in the 1870s, but it might have been the early 1880s, Chamberlain was campaigning for English agricultural labourers to be given 3 acres and a cow?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, the Irish land issue very much is something that he can sympathise with because of that, because he sees it as more broadly just the whole, that it's a land issue that exists across the British Isles. It's not purely an Irish one. So giving concessions to the Irish and bringing about a land bill to remedy things is entirely, from his point of view, of a piece with reform across the board.
He doesn't get that, by the way, guys, because Gladstone won't agree to it. Although what he does get passed was a small holdings bill eventually.
Yeah, and it's interesting at this point that one of the things that's also going through is what's known as the third reform bill, which is expanding the franchise to actually a lot of rural voters. And so Chamberlain is very much a big supporter of this, and he uses the passage of this act and then the upcoming general election in 1885 to start going around giving speeches about sort of what becomes known as his radical platform. This includes land reform, social reform. For example, one of the things he wants to bring in is old age pension, and also various other reforms, including the government. And I'm just going to quote from, it's been previously mentioned in the chat, there's a biography of Chamberlain by Enoch Powell, and I just want to read something from it. Just wait a second. The year 1885, correctly expected to be an election year, opened with the first pronouncement of what was to be Chamberlain's unauthorised programme, an articulate and consecutive exposition of radical social objectives, which, as he was a cabinet minister, could not have been dictated, could not but dictate the ground of the coming contest on the new franchising constituencies. The instrument was a series of speeches at intervals of 2 or 3 weeks, which progressed from the ransom that wealth ought to pay for security to compulsory land acquisition, universal manhood, and graduated taxation. A cabinet minister using this instrument is irresistible except by expulsion. How many other politicians have made use of it since have assured their leaders retrospectively, as Chamberlain did Gladstone, and equally sincerely, that had it been possible for me to submit to you beforehand the speech that I have recently delivered, I would readily have cancelled parts of them. Now, a reason I read that is that if anybody knows anything about the history of the life of Enoch Powell, you will know that the reason why he gets sacked from the Tory shadow cabinet in 1968 is because he gave an unauthorised speech on immigration. And I've got to say, when Powell was writing that, he must have had a smile on his face. So anyway,
I would just say, Arron, that that was the official excuse for sacking him, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, he must have been smiling when he wrote that one.
And so the Liberals go into the 1885 general election with this that sort of radical unauthorised proposal, that radical sort of manifesto, as it were, is something that that Chamberlain is very much advocating for, and he obviously has two sort of motives in the 1885 general election. One is obviously to see the Liberals re-elected, but the second one is to see the Whig wing of the Liberal Party sort of removed from power and his radical wing to take over. So part of the reason why he gives those sort of radical speeches advocating that unauthorised programme is to take on the Whig wing of the Liberal Party and take it over. And so take over the Liberal Party.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out, that again, these days, many people don't realise that in the 19th century, the Whig Pie, which was the more, I hesitate to say right wing, but it was the right hand bit of the Liberal Pie, the older.
I mean, we talked about it in the Glorious Revolution stream. I mean, they're sort of the holdovers. Effectively, they were just originally very anti-Catholic and very much pro Protestant Church of England.
But they were
types.
also very laissez-faire. Like they didn't want to interfere with anything, basically. And people like Chamberlain and the radical liberals were very much looking at the social situation in the country and thinking, you kind of have to interfere if you're going to improve the lives of the poor people, which people like Chamberlain wanted to. Chamberlain was, by the way, very anti-socialist. He didn't like the socialists at all. He thought rightly that they would divide society on class lines. But on the other hand, he also realised that in terms of keeping the country on a good level and the whole country rising up, laissez-faire wasn't enough, and it wasn't, to be fair.
No, and the thing is, you'll have a lot of people. I know there's a lot of people on the right like to criticise the thought process of people like Chamberlain, everything as being a bleeding heart liberal and the root of the problems today and all that. But you cannot get away from the reality that there was immense. I mean, like never been seen before in human history, where the landscape of Britain and the technology of the modern world just changed very quickly in a very short space of time. And you had the social order of that. There was, I mean, it was long time change coming from that anyway. But what you had is you had people effectively coming to the right conclusion that you needed to have a structure. And the thing there is, and this is where I look at laissez. I mean, is there any scenario where laissez-faire has actually worked as intended, where you haven't had to have like some form of government to step in and actually take over? Because for me, that seems to be, and I know that's kind of like it's like a Thatcherite thing at the moment. The Thatcherite sort of thing comes from a lot of that, but it seems to me that a lot of when you look at this, it's inevitable because it does lead to some form of anarchy or a breakdown in the social order.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. We are in a situation today where everything is vastly over-regulated. But back in the day, there was often no regulation, and you need some basic regulation, obviously. I mean, Arron's been talking about Chamberlain's work in Birmingham, where he got clean water and he helped sort out the sewage system. He helped to make sure that people's gas appliances didn't explode and set fire to their homes in the middle of the night. That kind of stuff makes sense, it just does.
Yeah, it's interesting that at this period in time where Chamberlain's doing this as a radical programme, he is getting a number of the future founders of the Labour Party are very much drawn to the Liberal Party because of Chamberlain. So Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Slamton, who are respectively the first Labour Prime Minister and first Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, they are from sort of liberal backgrounds, and they're very much sort of drawn to the radicalism of Chamberlain's programme because it's seen as solving the social issues of the day. And I'll mention this now. It's that when in this biography, Powell does mention the fact, and I will just read this quote here about that if Chamberlain hadn't split the Liberals, he says that. Just wait a second. On the other hand, the Chamberlainite secession was at least one of the causes which condemned the Liberal Party to the eventual extinction at the hand of Labour. A Liberal Party which was led by a pre-1886 Chamberlain, might have accepted might have gained the acceptance as a vehicle for trade unionism. It certainly it could have become a party of the working class candidate. With the departure of the Chamberlainites, it was condemned to become the party of Asquith, and you very much see that those sort of radical liberals who are supporters of Chamberlain in the 1880s, amongst working class people, end up being the activists for the Independent Labour Party in the 1890s, and then senior figures, including, as I mentioned, the first Prime Minister and first Chancellor of the Exchequer in the post 20th, from the Edwardian era onwards. And so Chamberlain, this is one of the reasons why Chamberlain is described as a man who made the political weather. His actions in the 1880s very much set the mould of British politics for the next, not just with his activity during his active period in up until 1906, but beyond that into the aftermath of the First World War. Now, during the 1885 general election, he's campaigning on this programme. He's advocating to take on the Whigs and take on the Conservatives, and then the election is won by the Liberals with a plurality of votes, but they don't have a majority, and so the Irish Home Rule Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, are sort of holding the balance, and it's at this point that Gladstone has come round to the idea of Home Rule. It unlike a later generation of Liberals, saying when in sort of 1910, where you can make the argument that Asquith and the others were very much just backing Home Rule because of the parliamentary arithmetic. Gladstone does genuinely come rule is a solution to solve the Irish question, and there had been in the early 1880s talks between Gladstone and Parnell via Chamberlain and Parnell's right-hand man, Captain O'Shea, whose wife Kitty O'Shea Parnell was having an affair with, and which would ultimately destroy, when it became public, Parnell's career. However, in both these talks, the talks come to nothing, mainly because O'Shea is not being honest in both what he's telling Parnell and what he's telling Chamberlain. And so the attempts to come to some sort of compromise, both in the early 1880s and in 1885, really don't come to anything because of that. However, by the end of the talks in 1885, Gladstone is firmly come round to the idea of Home Rule. And so he then sets out his support for Home Rule. And in fact, I will quote again from the biography. So he has a cabinet meeting on the 26th of March, where he lays out his proposal for Home Rule. And let me just quote here. So they're immediately forward. The president of the local government board. So at this point, Chamberlain had gone from the Board of Trade to a local government board. One Joseph Chamberlain, who had been returned at the general election in the previous autumn for the constituency of West Birmingham, one of the 7 constituencies into which the city was newly divided, and into which were all won by Liberal candidates. We are the 7, as the saying went. He put forward 4 questions across the table to the Prime Minister. Was Irish representation at Westminster to cease? Was the power of taxation, including customs and excise, to be given to the Irish legislature? Was the appointment of judges and magistrates to be vested in the Irish authority? And was the Irish legislature to have the authority in every matter not specifically stated by the Act, applying to it, or only in matters specifically delegated to it by statutes? Gladstone, once again, did not prevaricate, did not refine or prevaricate. He answered yes to every one of these questions. And then Chamberlain said, I resign, whereupon he left the cabinet room once and all, accompanied by the Secretary of State for Scotland, Trevelyan.
So, for my own information, Arron, because I don't know this, was Gladstone's idea that even though he was going to set up an Irish Parliament, he was going to still have the Irish MP sitting in Westminster?
Yes, in fact, that remains a part of that remains a part of the Home Rule bills that are put forward both in 1886, which fails, 1984, which fails, 1894, and then the one that the Liberals tried to put forward before the First World War.
And of course, you could argue that we're in a similar situation today,
Yes.
because Scotland, for example, is vastly overrepresented in Westminster in terms of the Scottish population. Scotland has a lot more MPs per head of the population than England does, and the same thing I think is also true of Wales.
Absolutely.
And they have these devolved parliaments. So why are they still overrepresented in Westminster? Which has never made any sense to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, and you have the various formulas like the Barnett formula and everything, which was the claim was to design a way of actually making it fairer. I mean, in reality, I think the number of Scottish and Welsh Parliament seats in Westminster really should be, I mean, half near enough.
Yeah, and the big
if it went on a fair representation of the people as compared to say England, absolutely, yeah. And so you can't fault Chamberlain's logic on this, to be honest with you. You really can't.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
I was just going to say, didn't he do like it was like a speech of like saying, well, this Joseph Chamberlain on like, you know, he wouldn't like give the same rights to the metropolis, be referring to London, you know. He was all drawing like how ridiculous it would be London having its own.
He did, yes, he did, William. He said if 5 million Irishmen can have their own parliament, then why can't 5 million Londoners?
Yeah,
absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, London does today.
Yeah, I mean, you can say Chamberlain was well ahead of his time on seeing the problems with this.
Yeah, and the funny thing, I'd say, drawn on contemporary today, but I've been seeing on the like Telegraph and Times and the Express and various news outlets today saying that Starmer is actually trying to grab back powers from devolved parliaments, that being Scotland and Wales, and even in like the London Assembly as well. There is a plan to grab back certain powers, which I mean, I as I say, they should be abolished, but again, the one sensible thing
we should keep that, William, for a Saturday stream when we're talking about contemporary stuff.
Yeah, and so Chamberlain, as that quote says, walks out of the cabinet, runs out of the cabinet and resigns, and it is part of the reason why he opposes it is because he's come to the view that if you're going to have that, you can't. The whole situation, that situation will not hold. In fact, he had in the early 1870s written a letter to a friend where he remarked that if it came down to it and you couldn't have a federalised system, you couldn't do that. You couldn't have the business of the Irish having legislative independence and then having still MPs at Westminster. It would be far. The only two options would be, without the federalised system, would be either continue just no home rule and representation of Westminster, or some kind of protectorate state where the Irish would have no representation of Westminster and they would control their own affairs, but they would be some kind of protectorate. So essentially, something like the Isle of Man or the Channel Islands, and it's and so Chamberlain comes to the view that the federalisation idea cannot work because it would be too much of a sort of constitutional revolution for Britain, and so
he sees it. He sees it as the start of the end of the British Empire, basically.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, one of the sort of things that he's talking about in the 1870s is the idea of sort of applying Canadian sort of confederalism to Britain, but then he comes to see that's not going to work, and that also, as you say, that's going to undermine the British Empire. And so, when Gladstone presents his proposals to the cabinet, that is the last straw. So, as mentioned, that quote, he walks out, and he's joined in this by the leader of the Whig, Lord Hartington, and so they form the Liberal Unionists, who are a mixture of the Whiggish anti-Home Rule Liberals, and also quite a lot of the radical wing of the Liberal Party. And one thing that happens is that the Birmingham caucus goes with Chamberlain. Birmingham comes with him all the way. And that is because of his time as mayor, and before that in the National Education League, and then in his formation of sort of the Liberal Party sort of machinery in the country. And so the Liberal Unionist has almost immediately a political base in Birmingham and gradually the wider West Midlands. And so the Chamberlain's sort of attitude towards the Conservative at this point, which is led by Lord Salisbury, is very much his attitude that he had towards the Conservatives in the 1870s, which is, on this issue, we can very much work with them. But that he is not a Conservative, and the Liberal Unionists are a separate party. They are very much social reformers, radicals, and they are going to...
Arron, is it around this time that Chamberlain he has contacts with Churchill's father's little group of Conservatives? I think it's around this time, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Is it Tory Democrats or something like that?
Yeah, Tory democracy. Although they're also called the Fourth Party because they have a tendency of criticising the Tory front bench as much as they do the Liberal front bench, and so there is a degree of alliance there, especially over the issue of Irish Home Rule, because Lord Ranulph Churchill had been for Salisbury what Chamberlain had been for Gladstone when dealing with Parnell, because Lord Ranulph Churchill got on with Parnell quite well personally. And part of this is because, as it's been pointed out by historians quite recently, on every issue except Home Rule, Charles Stewart Parnell was a natural Tory, and so he and Randolph Churchill got on quite well, though they disagreed. And Churchill would very much in 1886 sort of put his colours to the mast with that remark about Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right, and so. And so there is an element of also an idea that Chamberlain, through someone like Randolph Churchill, can bring about sort of social reform through the Conservatives, but it's going to be a bit of a fight. Whereas the issue of Home Rule, there is no question that he can work with the Tories, absolutely. And so what you get over the course of the next roughly 10 years is, there's a small Tory government in power under Salisbury for a few months, then that falls, and then the Liberals come back in power for a short time, and then that falls. Then from 1887 to 1892, Salisbury's in power, and the issue of Home Rule is essentially off the table because the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists have overall majority, and so in this period, Salisbury, for example, passes what Duke has mentioned this before on numerous streams, the two-power standard of the Royal Navy. And Chamberlain is very much...
This is the era of splendid isolation, which is what our streams are named after. And it's what Arron was just saying. The Conservative government passes the two-power standard, which means the Royal Navy has to be larger than the next two largest navies in the world combined, and which basically means Britain is completely safe from any invasion.
Yeah, and Chamberlain sort of... So from 1887 up until 1895, Chamberlain's main focus is still Home Rule. It's combating Home Rule. But the empire starts coming more to the fore in his politics. So, for example, there is in 1887 a dispute between Canada and the United States over sort of fishing dispute between, particularly Newfoundland.
It's Newfoundland, and of course Newfoundland was not then part of Canada. It was still a separate colony in those days, I believe.
Yeah. Yes, it was. Yes, sorry, it was. I don't think that became part of Canada until 1949, maybe. So it's quite.
Yeah, it was after World War II for sure. But also, of course, that's when Chamberlain meets his third wife.
Yes.
And we're not going to go too much on his personal life on this stream because this is a political history, really. But Chamberlain was married 3 times. And I think Arron mentioned this very early on in the stream. 2 of his wives, his first 2 wives, both died in childbirth. And as a result of that, most people I've read think that Chamberlain was a nonconformist, but I think he largely lost his Christian faith because of the fact he lost 2 wives in childbirth. His 3rd wife is an American lady from a rich family, and it's strange. Chamberlain wasn't that popular with the aristocracy in Britain because he was seen as a radical, and he was very much a middle-class chap rather than an aristocrat. And despite his monocle and his orchids that he wears, that you can see in that picture we have up, he was very much a middle-class chap. And he wasn't popular with the aristocracy, but it's his 3rd American wife who actually introduces them into high society, because there was always this crossover between the WASPs in America and the English aristocracy, which I always find is quite interesting. And, I'm one of those people that think America had quite a large part in the downfall of Britain and the Empire in later years. But I think it's interesting that it was his 3rd wife. There's a famous painting of her by John Singer Sargent, and she was a very attractive lady. And she actually sort of gave him an entree into British high society. It's quite interesting. I'm sorry, Arron, I interrupted you. To carry on.
No, actually, I was going to bring up his family, because I think I won't go into too much detail, but I will just mention the fact that also I wanted to mention something about America, sort of influence on his political campaign as well. But in terms of his family, though obviously he loses 2 wives and his faith, he is very, very close to his children, particularly his 2 oldest sons, Austin Chamberlain, who becomes Sir Austin Chamberlain, who's a significant Conservative politician in the Edwardian era into the interwar period, and obviously Neville Chamberlain, who becomes Prime Minister. And there's an interesting occasion in the early 1890s. So I think this is 1893. Chamberlain's known as a great campaigner, a great sort of speech maker, but he doesn't mention his private life much in public. But in 1892, Austin Chamberlain gets elected as an MP in Birmingham as a Liberal Unionist. And Gladstone sort of makes a reference to this complimentary in a complimentary manner, sort of, and praising Austin Chamberlain, saying that Joseph Chamberlain was very proud. And Chamberlain shows a very rare, is a rare example of showing actual emotion, that he's genuine paternal pride that his son is now an MP, and so that his private life his family life is deeply important to him, but it's something that is rarely, if ever, brought up in public, except on an occasion like that. Now, when it comes to the United States, Chamberlain is influenced. This is even before he meets his wife, in the way the American presidents campaign and the way that they can sort of the political machines that are developed in the United States. And so you can see Chamberlain in the 1870s and 1880s drawing on that sort of experience the Americans have in the big cities for creating the Birmingham caucus. And then through his wife, Duke mentioned him being sort of introduced to the British sort of upper classes in a real way socially. He's also introduced to a degree to the American political upper classes, because his wife is she's the daughter of a niece of a then serving American member of the US cabinet. And so he is able to sort of talk to them about how they do things in terms of electioneering. And that really comes into its own in the 1900 general election, which we'll come to shortly. So Chamberlain, from pretty much 1886 up until 1895, he is very much looking at empire, and he's looking at the idea of Imperial Federation. And it's interesting that Imperial Federation comes before tariff reform. He goes on tours of Canada and Australia, and he talks with politicians there, and those politicians are all saying to him, "Yeah, the idea of Imperial Federation we like, but we need the tariffs taken down. And this continues into the 1890s. And now Chamberlain doesn't become fully committed to tariffs until essentially like the very late 1890s into sort of 1900, 1901.
Absolutely, Arron. It becomes almost an essential prerequisite. If you're going to have Imperial Federation, you kind of have to have tariff reform. But we're going to come on to that in a bit in the second half of this stream. Before we do, let me do a little bit of channel admin, please. Guys, please do hit the like button, hit that thumbs up button. It really does help the channel. It takes you a second, doesn't cost anything. Also, if you want to support the channel, or if you would like to ask Arron, William, or myself a question, you can do so via Entropy. That's pinned at the top of the chat on YouTube. And support for the channel is much appreciated because it costs me a lot more money than I make on it. So, yeah, go for it, guys. But yeah, we're kind of getting on to the second half of Chamberlain's career, although actually it's more like the third, to be honest. But yeah, I think it's the bit that he's most famous for, and in some circles infamous for, I guess. I think it's worth saying that this when he sent across to sort out this fishing dispute between Newfoundland and the USA, he's very successful at that, by the way, and it raises his prestige quite a bit, particularly within the conservative side of things, because he's just switched parties, of course. So
yeah, very much so, and also throughout this sort of early 1890s, he and the Conservatives are both coming to the view that his social reform isn't necessarily a threat to the social order, that the Conservatives can actually accommodate him, and he can see them as, on that issue, being very easy partners to pass that. And so the Liberal Unionists were in the late 1880s, they're very much seen as a separate party from the Conservatives, but by the mid-1890s, they're seen as sort of integral partners. And a very famous remark in The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, where there's a lady, I think it's Lady Bracknell, who mentions that somebody coming to dinner and she asked their politics, and they said, oh, the Liberal Unionists, and it's, oh, they're Tories as well. I can't remember the exact quote, but by that stage, that comes out in 1895, I think. And so by that stage, the relationship between the Liberal Unionists and Conservatives is so close that they are seen as interchangeable. And from this point on, up until well into the 1920s nationally, and in Birmingham, well into the 1930s, the Conservatives and Liberal Unionists campaign, and then after 1912, the Conservatives campaign as Unionists. And so the Chamberlain, in 1893, Gladstone tries to put through another Home Rule bill. That fails, and he resigns. And then you have, for a year, the leadership of the Premiership of Lord Rosebery, who was probably the most useless Prime Minister of at least Queen Victoria's reign, if not British history as a whole, which takes some doing, but he was utterly useless. And his leadership ends in sort of disaster, and in terms of the internals, the Liberal Party. And so it's a general election in 1895, the Unionists win, and Salisbury appoints Chamberlain as Colonial Secretary. And so Chamberlain will be...
But, Arron, sorry to interrupt you, mate, but it's worth pointing out that other than Home Secretary, Chamberlain could have had any cabinet position he wanted. He couldn't be Home Secretary because Salisbury had promised that to somebody else. He couldn't be Foreign Secretary because Salisbury wanted that for himself. Salisbury was always, mostly, I should say, until near the end of his prime ministership, he was mostly his own Foreign Secretary because that was his area of expertise. But other than those two jobs, he could have had anything. He could have been Home Secretary. He could have been Treasurer, which is generally seen as the second most powerful person in the cabinet after the Prime Minister. And he chose colonial secretary, which was a relatively minor cabinet role, even though the British Empire was a third of the world in those days.
Yeah.
So I'm sure Aaron's about to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's very much it's a post that has some importance, but you also at the same time people need to remember there's the post of Secretary of State for India exists, and the Indian Empire is an entity unto itself, and that has in some ways more sort of prestige than say the Colonial Secretary. And in fact, up until I think it was the 1850s, the posts of Colonial Secretary and War Secretary were combined. It's not seen as at this point as necessarily the biggest post in the world, but Chamberlain taking it on is very much because of his interest at this point in colonial affairs in the empire.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that one of the things about Chamberlain is that he saw the importance of the settler colonies. He visited these places, like as Arron said, he'd been to Canada, he'd been to Australia, and he goes to South Africa as well. He saw the importance of the white settler colonies, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also later on South Africa. And it's those places that he really wants to federate. He does see the importance economically of parts of Africa and all the rest of it, and he actually does quite a lot of work to develop those places economically, and with railways and what have you. But his main focus, when you talk about Imperial Federation, Chamberlain's not really interested in sending Ghanaians and or rather people from the Gold Coast, as it would have been then, or Nigerians, or even Indians to the British Parliament. That's not what he's trying to do. Imperial Federation was mainly about the white settler colonies, and I think that's very important to emphasise.
I mean, Arron Hook is actually right, because the complexity, I think maybe people, and I've never seen a lefty ever be able to describe the actual in the hard details of the British Empire and realm at large. As you said, even with India was its own entity, technical political entity, and that was under a form of imperial governance, but then also the various regional monarchs and so on and so forth under that. Of course, you had like the Canada that at this point was already its own self-governing dominion. And then you had the various colony and high commissionerships. And of course, at this point, you've had like Africa as well, and you have the African Company. Of course, you then have the regional monarchs as well. So
you had Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company, which of course opened up Rhodesia. You had the Niger Company, which was Colonel Goldie, opening up areas in northern West Africa. All of this stuff was going on at the same time, but the Imperial Federation idea, and also just to make it clearer to people, the idea for Imperial Federation ultimately, for those who supported it, and the idea really started in the 1870s, was that you would have an imperial parliament that the white settler colonies and, of course, Britain would send representatives to in proportion to their population. So, you might have, let's take a figure out the air and say 50 people from Britain, and then you'd probably have, 12 from Canada, and 10 from Australia, and 5 from New Zealand, and probably 3 from South Africa. It would have been something like that. Don't take any notice of my actual figures. I'm just trying to give rough proportions. But that was the idea, and all it would cover would be foreign policy and defence. Everything else would still be handled by the nation's own parliaments. But the Imperial Parliament would have been responsible for imperial defence and, broadly speaking, imperial foreign policy, which would have made a lot of sense.
Well, this is the problem the British Empire faced, because you couldn't compare, let's say, the Dominion of Canada to the recent as you said, the colony of Gold Coast or something like that. You had to,
No,
or
absolutely
even,
not. No.
and because this is the thing is, and this is what people when they talk about when they and I. By the way, you guys, when I'm doing this research to this, I found a horrendous article and like a seminar on what was it they referred to decolonizing Joseph Chamberlain, which is probably the funniest,
Oh
most
my
ironic
God.
statement
Oh
it's
my
probably the,
God.
it's probably one of the best statements I've ever heard. And but one thing they've failed to look, because of course their critique on this, of course, is his, evil, white man policy sort of stuff. But what they failed to realize is there were two aspects of the empire. You had the settler colonies, where you had, like Australia, like New Zealand, sparsely populated with, and I'm going to be absolutely honest here, particularly in New Zealand's case, savage, backward people, very sparsely populated. Same in Canada as well, in the Americas.
Yeah,
And you
hang on.
had,
Just to be clear, guys, he's not talking about the settlers. He's talking about the Aboriginals in those countries. Sorry.
yeah, sorry. Those damn Irish and penal colony savages. No, but you and what you had is you had this effectively English British society being recreated in Australia, in New Zealand, and in Canada. And we've all seen like the clips from from maybe like the 1910s, 1920s, like old, really old footage. It might as well be somewhere in England, and that is why, and
Same
South
in
Africa
same.
as well.
I was going to say same in parts of South Africa. Natal, for example, was absolutely a white settler colony, and
Yeah,
and the Cape was about 50-50 roughly.
yeah, and when you see these places, and when you see any imperialists from any political party, or any sort of political persuasion throughout you see why there is that calling for a federation, because this is about and this is the most obvious thing, it's about securing the future from the empire, because the biggest problem that empires face is siphoning off and separatism.
And also, guys, look at Rhodesia. Another example, as I mentioned earlier, Rhodesia was opened up by the British South Africa Company, which was basically Cecil Rhodes and his supporters. And Cecil Rhodes was also Prime Minister of the Cape for quite a long time. And because he was supported by moderate Afrikaners as well as the English speakers. And it was these guys that people like Chamberlain were interested in federating. And the reason for it is that Germany, for example, had been unified in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. And Germany had a much bigger population than Britain did. But if you added in the settler colonies, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, that wasn't true. It was much fairer. And even more important, people like, and I'm sure Arron's going to talk about this in a minute, but people like Chamberlain could also see that in the longer term, continental-sized nations like the USA and indeed Russia, they were going to inherit the earth eventually. And the one way that Britain could compete with them, not exactly on level terms, but on much fairer terms, was to federate the empire. So this was the idea and the thinking behind it, although I'm sure Arron will have some stuff to say about that in a minute.
Yeah, very much. So just to add to what William was saying about how places like Australia, Canada, and areas of South Africa, like Britain, there used to be the old saying about Rhodesia, particularly southern Rhodesia, that it was, to quote, like Basing Stoke in the bush. These are places that do look very much like Britain. They are not foreign in that way. And there's two things going on during Salisbury's government in terms of dealing with the situation, both the colonies and with their foreign affairs, particularly with the European powers. So Chamberlain is very much, obviously colonial secretary, he's focusing on sort of the colonial office, and particularly focusing on South Africa, because obviously there's been a long-term attempt by the British to confederate South Africa in the way that Canada had happened, in the way that the way that Australia would soon federate. That, of course, the big period of that being previously between 1874 and 1881, and that hadn't. And then from that you get the Zulu War, the first Boer War. But then it comes back on the table very much because in South Africa you've had the discovery of gold at Witwatersrand in what is then the Republic of South Africa, more commonly referred to as the Transvaal. And there have been a huge influx of non-Boers into the Transvaal, and they essentially created Johannesburg out of nothing. And there is a push by these new rivals, who are known as Uitlanders, by the Boers to, they want rights. They essentially are second-class citizens in the Transvaal. And this is becoming a particular issue of tension between the British and the Transvaal. The other Boer republic, the Orange Free State, has always had reasonably good relations with the British. And so, but there's tensions there growing because there are elements within the Orange Free State that see themselves as, because obviously the two Boer states see that the Orange Free State should grow closer to the Transvaal. And this is where we get the first big issue in Chamberlain's career at the Colonial Office, which is the Jameson raid.
But before you talk about that, Arron, it's worth pointing out that I think it was in 1877, Britain had annexed the Transvaal, which at that stage was bankrupt.
Yes.
And this was under Disraeli before the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. And the Transvaal was bankrupt. It had little native wars going around all of its borders. And people were quite worried. Their civil servants weren't being paid. And so Britain annexed the place. Now, Paul Kruger and others then launched a rebellion against the British, which went very badly. This is in 1880, by the way, just after the Anglo-Zulu War. Needless to say, immediately the Zulu War was won. Most of the British troops in South Africa were shipped home or somewhere else in the empire, and there were only a few forces left in Natal. The Boers rebelled, and the war did not go at all well for the Brits. At some stage, I will do a stream on this series about the first Anglo-Boer War, and it didn't go at all well. And by the time the war broke out, Gladstone was Prime Minister. And Gladstone was, to my own mind, he was kind of the Tony Blair of his day. He was known as the murderer of Gordon because he wouldn't do anything to try and save General Gordon in the Sudan till it was far too late. And the Anglo-Boer War was one of his biggest mistakes because he basically surrendered. I can't put it any differently, really. Big British reinforcements were on their way to South Africa, but before we could actually start fighting and negotiate from a situation of strength, Gladstone basically surrendered. But to cover his surrender, he kept a vague thing called British sovereignty over the Transvaal, which basically, according to the Brits, meant we were going to control their foreign policy, but the Boers never saw it that way. They saw it, unsurprisingly, as something different. And because they won that war relatively easily and Britain hadn't fought, later on, they're willing to get very truculent indeed with Britain. And this is when you then come to the Jameson raid. Now, as Arron was explaining, the Outlanders were a big group of people who moved to the Transvaal to work in the gold mines. Most of them were British, but by no means all of them. And even the British guys included loads of Australians and Canadians and people like that. But there were also lots of Americans, there were lots of Germans, there were quite a lot of Irish guys. And so they were by no means a totally united group. But they were all pissed off with the Transvaal because in order to vote in the Transvaal, I think initially you had to be a resident for 15 years. And eventually Kruger reduced that to 10 years. But you can understand why. Because the Transvaal, the South African Republic, as it was really called, was a rural country with very few large towns. The Outlanders probably could eventually, by the 1890s, probably could have outvoted the actual original Boer Afrikaner population. So
it probably would have outpopulated them as well, or
yeah,
significant minority.
Yeah, absolutely. They could have outvoted them to some degree. So you can understand why the Transvaal wouldn't give them equal rights entirely. You can understand that if you look at it from the Boer Afrikaner point of view. But also, as I say, they won the First Boer War pretty easily. They thought they could do it again. And of course, this was Gladstone's fault. Gladstone had made this war almost inevitable, if you ask me, particularly once gold and what have you had been discovered there. Now, there was supposed to be a Uitlander uprising in Johannesburg, and they'd been smuggling rifles into the place for months and months and months. And the idea was there was going to be an Outlander uprising, and then Leander Starr Jameson, who was Cecil Rhodes's lieutenant, was going to ride in with about 600 odd guys from the British South African police, etc., and rescue them. And the British government would then intervene. And as I'm sure Arron's going to explain to us in a bit more detail in a minute, Chamberlain knew some of this, certainly he did. And I think he passed some of it on to Salisbury. And if there's an uprising in Johannesburg and then Jameson rides into the rescue, the British government can legitimately intervene. But of course, what actually happens is the Outlanders get cold feet and they won't rebel. They're scared. They're also making a lot of money. People who are making a lot of money often don't want to risk things. And so the uprising fizzles. And Cecil Rhodes, for example, who was absolutely deeply involved in this, he's sending desperate telegrams to Jameson saying, stay where you are, don't invade, don't go in. And Jameson, being a twat, basically, decided, no, I'm going to invade the Transvaal with 600 blokes, which was fucking ridiculous, frankly. He was never going to win. There were thousands and thousands of well-armed burghers with some of the best weapons that Europe could provide. The Boer artillery in the 1890s was more modern than the British artillery was. They had the latest German Mauser rifles and you name it. This was a ridiculous thing that he did. And incidentally, if you know the famous Kipling poem "If," that is actually based on Leander Starr Jameson. So it's a really good poem, but I'm not sure it's really made to a very sensible guy, because Jameson should have done what Rhodes told him and stayed where he was. But anyway, Arron, carry on, mate.
Yeah, Chamberlain's convinced to support it by Rhodes making the argument that if you don't do this, the Uitlanders in the Transvaal will essentially do it themselves, and they will become a sort of South African United States. And so Chamberlain sort of convinced to support it. However,
100%, Arron. Thank you. That's something that's often not brought out. Is that, and as I said earlier, the Uitlanders, although the majority of them were British, by no means all of them were. You know, they weren't all British. There were plenty of Americans. There were plenty of Irishmen who would have happily set up something totally independent of Britain in the Transvaal.
What was it in the Transvaal? They were already referring to them. It was already being referred to as the South African Republic. I mean, I know it's like interchangeable between the Transvaal Republic and.
No, it was the real name of the Transvaal was the South African Republic, but everyone just called it the Transvaal for short because that was the provincial name. But it was really called the South African Republic.
And so Chamberlain gives his unofficial support to the raid, but he is never told when the raid is taking place. So, for example, he first informs Lord Salisbury of the situation, that there is expected to be a revolt in Johannesburg on Boxing Day 1895. However, Chamberlain, as I say, doesn't know when it's going to happen, and so he's at the same time. Something else is happening at this point. There's what's called the Venezuela crisis going on, where Britain, Germany, and the United States are having a bit of a standoff over Venezuela because Venezuela's not paying its debts.
Two things here, Arron. One is it's the Samoan crisis. Actually, I think Samoa. Hang on. There was the Samoan crisis because that was between Britain, Germany, and the United States. But there was also a border dispute between Venezuela and what's the place called? A British South American.
Oh yeah, Guyana,
yeah. And there was a border dispute. And the Americans decided, for whatever reason, probably due to an American election, that they were going to say, oh, well, if Britain really wants to get angry with Venezuela, we'll fight Britain. Which would have been very foolish for the Americans.
Isn't that part of just their their legacy of Monroe Doctrine, keeping European powers out of the Americas?
All right,
hemisphere.
This is going to take us a little bit. The Monroe Doctrine only worked in the 19th century because the Royal Navy supported it. The American Navy was not powerful enough to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and the American Army certainly wasn't. Like the American Army in the 1890s was about 25,000 guys. It made the British Army look enormous. Actually, it was probably about 40,000 by then. But anyway, it still made the British Army look enormous. But the American Navy was not powerful enough to do this in the 1890s. When America and Spain went to war in 1898, if the British had not wanted to allow the Americans to do it, the British could have stopped the Americans fighting Spanish. But as it happened, Britain was the only European power, the one and only one, which was pro-American. And we were the only one that actually could have said to the Americans, no, we're not going to let you attack the Philippines. We're not going to let you attack Cuba. And the Americans could have done nothing whatsoever about that. Their Navy was just too small in 1898. So this is later than what we're talking about now. But what Arron is correct about is that Chamberlain was saying to Rhodes and the conspirators, they had to hurry up and do this because there was a good chance Britain was going to get involved with the Americans over this situation in South America.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Sorry, Arron.
And that's quite right. I think there's another thing with Venezuela that takes place, I think, in 1903 or 1904, where it's us and the Germans doing something with Venezuela.
There was an early 20th century thing as well, but this particular one was more a border dispute, if I remember correctly. And the Americans said, oh, well, we're going to arbitrate this. And eventually, because Salisbury at this stage was busy with the reconquest of the Sudan, and eventually with Fashoda, which actually ruined French hopes in North Africa. He was busy with that, and he couldn't be asked to fuck around with South America. So he basically more or less gave way to the Americans over Venezuela.
Yeah, and so that's going on in the background with the Colonial Office and Chamberlain. So he sends those cables down to Rhodes, and then when He finally hears that the raid has taken place, which is on the 31st of December, which is 2 days after it started. Chamberlain can sort of see how this is not going to succeed. And he famously declares, if this succeeds, it will ruin me. I'm going up to London to crush it. And so he informs the Governor-General of South Africa, of the Cape, the Governor of the Cape, Hercules Robinson, to repudiate the raid and sort of make it clear to Rhodes that if things aren't sorted out, the British South Africa Company's charter is going to come into question. And so Chamberlain is, from this point onwards, trying to stop the mess from getting any worse than it is. But as you said, Duke, I agree with you that Chamberlain was aware beforehand, but he wasn't implicated to the degree that some people like to claim he was. This was something that Rhodes and Jameson were very much at the heart of, and Chamberlain was on the sidelines, as it were. That he was brought in at the last minute, just because they needed to make sure the British government would back it.
Yeah, I've heard the critics of Rhodes say that this was the occasion where he actually went rogue. Is that entirely true, or was that it? Because I know we talk about like London basically said, like, listen, hurry up because we've got other things. But it sounds to me that ultimately it just was a scale of miscommunication, and then the incompetence of Jameson. There was like a.
It's really the failure of the uprising in Johannesburg, which is the central point. Like, if the Uitlanders had actually risen, and as I said, they'd been smuggling rifles and what have you to them for months. And if thousands and thousands of these guys had actually risen up in Johannesburg, then it could have been presented that, Jameson was riding to their rescue. And then the British government could have turned around and said, okay, we're going to send 10,000 soldiers marching into the Transvaal, and we're going to settle this. But if there's no uprising, you can't do that. Okay, without the uprising, the miniature invasion of 600 blokes, it was always going to lose, Look, Jameson's thinking was, if I can get to Johannesburg with my whole 600 soldiers who were actually paramilitary cops for the most part, mounted policemen, his thinking was, if I can get there, maybe they'll rise. My view is, if they didn't rise before, they're not going to rise because 600 guys arrived there. It's not enough. They would be foolish to do that. I also noticed that Duarte fan in the chat said there was a considerable Jewish population among the Uitlanders. I'm not sure. There were quite a lot of Jewish mine owners, right? There were what was called the gold bugs, who were many of them were Jewish. But I'm not sure there was a huge population of Jewish people there. There would have been some, of course, traders and shopkeepers and what have you. But most of the South African Jewish population actually arrived in the 1930s, because South Africa was one of the very few countries that was willing to take Jewish refugees from the mid-century Germans and all that. And they were thanked for that by people like Joe Slomo, who was a Jewish communist, who supported the ANC. So that should teach nice. That should teach people. That should teach people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's the thank I get. Every Boer should be saying that's the thank we get.
Yeah, exactly. The South Africans in the 1930s were willing to take Jewish refugees, and Joe Slomo, his parents were Jewish refugees from Germany, who South Africa took in the 1930s, and he then joined the ANC and destroyed South Africa, basically. But that should teach you about small hats to some degree.
So going back to this Uitlander rebellion, which just didn't materialize, and sort of led to this sort of the failed raid. Who was on the ground coordinating it? Was it Cecil Rhodes' guy, or was it Was it the? It was. So Jameson was the one on the ground. He was meant to be
No,
coordinating.
Jameson was in Basutoland. Jameson was in Basutoland, but there were other representatives of Rhodes in Johannesburg.
Yeah, Rhodes' brother, Frank Rhodes, was a senior figure in what was known as the Reform Committee, which is the leadership of
But as we said earlier, the thing to remember about the Uitlanders is whilst most of them were British, there was a considerable minority of people from the USA, from Ireland, from Germany, from France. Those guys weren't in support of Britain taking over the Transvaal at all.
So it was like a bit of a misjudgment of the mood. Yeah, not happy that Uitlanders were treated differently, but it wasn't enough to like get them into armed revolt, sort of thing.
No, look, these guys, they were paying quite high rates of tax. They weren't allowed to vote, but on the other hand, they were making quite a lot of money. And
yeah, the tax offset for the actual what they were making, it was they
were doing quite well, financially, but it was a big mess because if you don't get the uprising in Johannesburg, then Jameson's invasion, the famous Jameson's raid, was pointless because 600 guys weren't going to take over the Transvaal. It was ridiculous,
So with Jameson, was this? Cause I know that was Jameson arrested? I think he was arrested, wasn't he? Or there was quite a few arrests after.
His guys were all those of his guys who were not killed were all arrested, and eventually they were sent to Britain for trial, and they got some time in prison, but it wasn't long. But they did. They all got sent. Jameson was sent to prison, and as I say, if you read Kipling's poem "If," that is based on Leander Starr Jameson, who was a medical doctor, by the way.
One thing we should point out is that about the aftermath of the Jameson raid, there was a public inquiry alongside these trials, in which Chamberlain was actually exonerated, and Chamberlain, and there was an occasion in the House of Commons where Chamberlain probably did lie about his knowledge of his involvement with it, because he was consistently claiming that he didn't know what was going on, which is obviously not true because he, as mentioned already, he had been informed, whilst not knowing when the rebellion was going to take place. He knew from Rhodes that a rebellion was going to take place. And so,
someone lying in Parliament, Arron, who would have believed it?
Well, actually, Arron, the running joke. What is it? The running joke is that a public inquiry is the best way to cover up and bury government incompetence or like ministerial incompetence or something like that.
Yeah,
and to be fair, there was no physical evidence of what Chamberlain knew. But as Arron said, of course, he knew roughly what was going on, but he expected there to be an uprising in Johannesburg. And he certainly didn't think that Rhodes's lieutenants would be dumb enough to launch an invasion when there wasn't an uprising.
Yeah, and the sort of public view thing is actually quite sympathetic to Chamberlain, also sympathetic to sort of Jameson and those who end up on trial in Britain. So Chamberlain has a bit of sort of criticism from the opposition, but more broadly in the country, he's not regarded as being in the wrong, essentially, and there's a great deal of sympathy for the men who rode with Jameson's, and so by the end of sort of 1897, the whole thing has been sort of wrapped up and sort of everybody's sort of moving on from it. And one of the things that happens in the immediate aftermath of the raid, and this is important for something we're going to talk about once we've probably dealt with the Boer War and Chamberlain, is that the Kaiser sends a telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal, congratulating him. And this goes down in Britain about as well as you can imagine.
Yeah, the Kaiser, as I always say, was not the brightest tool in the shed. And he sends a telegram, it's known as the Kruger telegram, to Kruger, and he says something along, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty accurate. congratulations on saving your country without calling on the help of a friendly power, meaning Germany, of course. Not that Germany could have done anything, given the German Navy was still relatively small at that stage. But yeah, the Kaiser was a dumbass, basically. He really was. And as Arron said, this is a good segue because Chamberlain tries 3 times to get some sort of understanding with Germany, between Britain and Germany, and fails totally just because the Germans are so fucking stupid, basically. But anyway.
Yeah, Chamberlain sort of Chamberlain. It's not 3 times; it's twice. But they take place one before the Boer War, one before the Second Boer War, one afterwards. And the first attempt, Chamberlain it's roughly in the aftermath of when this the Kruger telegram was sent. And importantly, it's strictly unofficial, and it's mostly to do with China, where Chamberlain essentially goes to the German ambassador in London and says, "Well, we have shared interests in China. We can come to some find accommodation." Now, Lord Salisbury, who is the Prime Minister, regards any attempt to come to some accommodation with Germany as completely unworkable, because the Germans, being a continental power, they have diverging interests with Britain, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be an enemy of Britain, but they're never by any means going to be an ally of Britain. But he lets Chamberlain go ahead with this, partly because it's strictly unofficial, but also he takes the view that the only way that Chamberlain is going to come to see the reality of the situation is actually by coming sort of face to face with German demands. And so these negotiations take place between 1898 and 1899, and they come to nothing, partly because at this point the Germans are putting through their first Navy bill. And the way that gets sort of passed is that the senior German naval officer, Alfred von Tirpitz, essentially the way he gets it passed is by characterising Britain as the threat to Germany. And so there's no way on God's green earth the Germans are going to accept any kind of accommodation because of that. And so Chamberlain is very despondent after that. He famously, in May 1899, gives a speech in Germany, gives a speech in Birmingham referring to sort of Britain's relationship in the world, and sort of in reaction to sort of the favour of the talk with the Germans, remarks, "We have no allies. I'm afraid we have no friends. We stand alone." And this sort of situation does sort of kick off a set of diplomatic talks which under Salisbury that leads to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, because Salisbury takes the view that yes, we need isolation, but also we need an ally or two, and we need some reasonably stable relations with other countries. And so you will get that after the Boer War. But I think we should talk about the Boer War, because this is very much a war that's regarded as sort of Chamberlain's involvement in it, because he's very much regarded as Joe's war, is how it's remarked. And
yeah, look, we'll come back to the German stuff and the Anglo-Japanese stuff in a minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the Anglo-Boer War, you have to understand that South Africa in 1898, so after the Jameson raid, but before the Anglo-Boer War breaks out, South Africa is made up of 4 major parts. There are various protectorates and what have you scattered around it, but in general, there are 4 bits. There's the British colony of Natal, which is mostly British. There's some Afrikaners in the north, particularly, but it's very much a British colony. Then there's the Cape, which is probably about 60-40 Afrikaner English. But basically, the 2 groups get on pretty well in the Cape. As I said, Cecil Rhodes was Prime Minister of the Cape twice, I think. So those 2 are British. Then there is the Orange Free State, which is a relatively what's the word? It's a fairly moderate Afrikaner republic. It's mostly a rural farming place. And then you have the Transvaal. And the Transvaal, of course, is now very rich because the goldfields of the wit waters around Johannesburg. And obviously the Boer government is taking in vast amounts of money from this. And they use that money to buy the latest armaments from the world. So the Boer artillery is Krupp and Creusot, Krupp German and Creusot French guns. They're more modern, they have a longer range and a faster rate of fire than British Royal Artillery guns. They also go and buy the latest German Mauser magazine rifles to equip all their burghers. They don't have much in the way of regular armed forces. The Boer system is commandos, and that is basically all the guys from every town or village and local area made up into a commando of volunteers. But on the other hand, most of these guys are frontier farmers. They spend a lot of time hunting for for food and what have you. They're very good shots. They know the country. They're very good horsemen. They're all of them are mounted. So the South African regular forces, the Afrikaner regular forces, are very small. They have both the Orange Free State and the Transvaal have a regular artillery regiment, which is particularly in the case of the South African Republic, the Transvaal, it's very well equipped. They even have 155 millimeter heavy guns, which they can move and set up far more easily than the equivalent British pieces, and are a lot more modern. The famous Long Tom guns from the Boer War. They also have the ZARPs, which are the South African police, who are paramilitary mounted policemen. These guys are kind of regular soldiers in a way, a bit like the Canadian Mounties or what have you. The rest of the Boer forces are basically all of the men between about 16 and 60. But they're good shots. They're used to the South African veldt and bush, and they're very well equipped. They've got very modern rifles. One of the things that is seldom brought out, even in military history books, is the British Lee Metford rifle was pretty much equivalent to the Boer Mauser, but in those days it didn't have clip loading, so you had to load the rounds individually, and it had a 10-round magazine which was twice as big as the Mauser, but you had to load all those 10 rounds separately, one at a time. Whereas the Mauser had clip loading, which is what the short magazine Lee Enfield had later on. So you can put 5 rounds in at a time on one clip, much quicker. And I don't think I've read a single South African military history book that even points that out. But anyway, it made a big difference. So following the Jameson raid, there are attempted negotiations, but they don't go very well. The Boers had easily crushed the Jameson raid. As I said earlier, they'd easily won the first Anglo-Boer War, or relatively easily anyway, and Britain had just given up. And why wouldn't Britain do the same thing again if you're an Afrikaner? And also, if you are Joseph Chamberlain and you want Imperial Federation, well, you can't federate 2 British colonies and 2 Dutch republics, can you? You can't. You need that to be one thing. You need it to be South Africa, and it needs to be British. So, Arron, William, you carry on.
Yeah, Chamberlain, after the Jameson raid, up until pretty much the spring of 1899, is hoping for a sort of negotiated solution. But at the same time, in August 1897, he had the appointment of Alfred Milner as the governor of the Cape, and he holds the post of High Commissioner of Southern Africa, so he's essentially the chief colonial official in Southern Africa. And Milner quickly comes to the conclusion that a diplomatic solution is not going to work, that if you're going to federate South Africa, Duke points out, it's going to be acted by force. And eventually Chamberlain is convinced by Milner of this. And frankly, Milner is right. And so the war itself eventually breaks out in late 1899, and it doesn't initially go very well for the British Army. There are a string of defeats, known as the Black Week. And whilst
can I just say, Arron, so people understand what's going on here, Britain did increase its garrison in Natal and the Cape, but not by much. I think in 1899 there were probably about 15,000 British soldiers in the whole of South Africa. There were another 5,000 on their way, and the South African Republic, the Transvaal under Paul Kruger, demanded of the British government that all the British troops in South Africa be withdrawn, and that the ones on the high seas that were sailing to South Africa had to sail away again to Britain or somewhere else. And of course, the British government could never accept this from the Transvaal. So that's how the war breaks out.
Yeah,
and don't we have like the Boers besiege? Was it Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley?
Yeah.
As sort of immediate result.
There are so few British soldiers in South Africa in October 1899 when the war breaks out. The Boers are able to invade not only Natal, but they're also able to invade the Cape as well, because they have a lot more men available than the Brits do in October 1899. As I say, there's only about 15,000 British soldiers in the whole of South Africa, and that includes like local British ancestry volunteers in the Cape and Natal. And so there are far more Boers available than there are Brits, and so the Boers immediately invade both British colonies.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the like Ladysmith, for example. Very close to the Transvaal and the boundary.
Oh, it was worse than that, actually, William. And I used to live in that part of the world. Okay, Ladysmith was, I don't know, 40 minutes motorbike ride for me. It's worse than that, because although the main British garrison was in Ladysmith, and incidentally, British soldiers with experience in South Africa, including Buller, who had fought in the Anglo-Boer War, he told the British government not to go beyond the Tugela River, because if you go beyond the Tugela River, you'll get surrounded. But of course, the local commanders at the time didn't take any notice of that. But not only did they garrison Ladysmith, which, as you rightly say, William, is not that far from the Transvaal border, far worse than that, they garrisoned Dundee, which was even closer to the Transvaal border, with just a brigade of
that's ridiculous,
regiments.
because I'm looking at the map, like with Dundee, all you need is a relative, a force to like come in from the south, and you'll just be surrounded from four sides.
What actually happened was the Boers occupied Talana Hill in Dundee, and the British chucked them off it at considerable cost, but they did win. The British infantry stormed the kopje and they took it. But as you rightly say, that by then they were being surrounded. But they were fortunate in that they managed to retreat back to Ladysmith by a helper car. And so they get to Ladysmith. But then, of course, the troops in Ladysmith are also surrounded because, as Buller had told the British government, don't go beyond the Tugela River. If you stayed the other side of the Tugela River, the Boers are going to find it very hard to get enough troops that far south. But they didn't. So the major British force in Natal get surrounded at Ladysmith and you get the famous siege. Now, at the same time, of course, the Boers, particularly from the Orange Free State, are pushing into the Cape and they surround Kimberley and they besiege that. And up in the north, they also besieged the little railway town Mafeking as well.
And that's where you have Colonel Robert Baden-Powell. Yeah.
Baden-Powell, yeah, he's at Mafeking, yeah. Sorry, Arron, you want to carry on there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, mentioning all these difficulties that are going on, Salisbury very much takes a hands-off approach to this war. Because he's taking place in South Africa, and the colonial office he deals with two big British colonies, the Cape and the Tall. Chamberlain is very much given free hands to be the overall overall direction to the war. And Salisbury very much sort of backs him up when he puts forward anything in cabinet. The one problem Chamberlain has is that he does not have complete control over the war. Obviously, all the military affairs are being run through the War Office, and the War Office is represented by Lord Lansdowne in the cabinet as Secretary of State for War. And Lansdowne is a constant thorn in the side by for Chamberlain, because, for example, Chamberlain wants to know when, for example, when the Boers are bombing Ladysmith, he wants to know what the guns are, and for reasons best known to himself, Lansdowne takes a long time and is really difficult in giving Chamberlain the answer to that question. I think Chamberlain eventually finds out through a report in the Times before he finds out from the War Office, and so he is exasperated with Lansdowne, and he's also privately critical of the way the army is conducting itself, in the fact because of the defeats. However, he is, in the House of Commons, the strongest defender of the government, and he is able to hold the line right up until the war turns in the British favour in the spring summer of 1900, and particularly the high water mark of this in the autumn in September 1900 when the Transvaal is formally annexed by the British, and this prompts the Conservatives to Salisbury decide, right, we're going to go to the country. And you have the 1900 general election, which is known as the Khaki election, and it's very much an election where Chamberlain is at the fore. Chamberlain is putting in practice those electioneering processes he's heard out about in the United States, and which is pioneered in Birmingham, and his Birmingham caucus succeeds in bringing not just Birmingham but the entire West Midlands into the Unionist cause, and the Unionists win an overall majority. And Chamberlain, over the next couple of years, so for the remainder of the Boer War, he's overseeing it. But after 1900, he makes his next attempt at an Anglo-German alliance, and again, his goal is to form an alliance, but it doesn't work for the same reason. Part of this has to do with the fact that the Germans have been not formally sympathetic to the Boers, but there's unspoken sympathy in private. There's unspoken sympathy in private between the Kaiser and senior figures within the German government. And added to this fact, Chamberlain wants to bring in possibly a proper military alliance, so Britain might join the Triple Alliance. At which point, for those people who don't know, that is the alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And one issue he has is Lansdowne keeps prevaricating. He won't he won't accept any military discussions go on, because he sees that as imposing a colonial secretary imposing himself on the war secretary, and this causes the German ambassador, who's at this point beyond pissed off with Lansdowne, to go to Salisbury directly and offer a demanding invitation for Britain to join the Triple Alliance, which, of course, Salisbury is absolutely opposed to. full stop. He does not want Britain committed in that way to the continent because he knows it won't serve British interests, and so that sort of thing sort of fall through. And it becomes quite clear to Chamberlain at that point that an alliance with Germany is not possible. However, some kind of accommodation over colonial affairs with the French is a possibility. And so starting in early 1902, just as the Boer War is coming to a close, Chamberlain is starting to discuss things with this French ambassador in London, a man called Paul Cambon, who will also be the ambassador at the outbreak of the First World War. Now, the Anglo-French relations at this point had sort of changed. You've had the French having to accept, after the Fashoda incident, that sort of the eastern half of North Africa, particularly Egypt, and the Suez Canal was very much in the British sphere of influence, combined with the fact that the French foreign minister during this period, a man called, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Théophile Delcasse, was himself an Anglophile, and he saw France coming to a reasonable accommodation with Britain as in French interest when they were facing with the Germans. And so the negotiations sort of start in their the negotiations that will eventually produce the Entente Cordiale begin at this point, where Chamberlain sees the French as somebody that you can, so essentially the men you can do business with over some colonial matters. And so the Anglo-German, attempted Anglo-German alliance is sort of dropped, and the idea of an accommodation with the French starts at this point.
Yeah, sadly, if you ask me. I think the Entente Cordiale was a complete mistake on the British point, from the British point of view. First with France and then with Russia. Big mistake. All the disadvantages of an alliance with none of the advantages. Someone, real Mr. Streets, asked me to put a map up. I put a map up now, and you can see here's Ladysmith. Here is Kimberley. I think Kimberley's shown on here. Actually, it's not. It's down here somewhere. Kimberley's about, oh, there it is. There's Kimberley, and Mafeking is there. And this is German Southwest Africa, which eventually the South Africans took it in 1914, and it became Southwest Africa, which is these days called Namibia. So, but anyway. But that's the Transvaal up there, and that's the Orange Free State. And the Boers were able to invade the Cape quite easily. Eventually, they even had commandos late in the war. They had commandos operating over here on the South African Atlantic coast. Because, Cape Colony was about 60% Afrikaner and about 40% English-speaking in those days. And there were many Cape rebels, by the way. Some of whom got shot, most of whom did not. The Boer War, of course, isn't a quick war. When Lord Roberts is made, we should quickly say, Buller, who was a very brave man, but not a particularly great general, manages to lose at Colenso, where he also manages to lose 12 British guns. And as I said, the British Royal Artillery guns actually had a shorter range and a slower rate of fire than the Boer guns. But he manages to lose 12 British guns there. Actually, I think he lost 10. I think they rescued 2. And while they're doing that, Lord Roberts' son was one of the volunteers to ride in with horse teams and try and rescue the guns under Boer rifle fire because they got far too close to the Boer commandos. And he's shot and killed. And he was Lord Roberts' only son. Anyway, and a lot of other people were also shot and killed trying to do the same thing. Then Buller goes to Spienkop, which is a place I've been to quite a few times. and the British actually managed to win that battle. They fight all day. They lose loads of guys. Boer shells are landing near their trenches at the rate of several a minute. And then in the night, the British commander abandons it, even though they'd held on to it all day. And the Boers also thought they'd lost and pissed off, but then in the morning they were surprised to find the British had retired. So they'd actually won at Spearncott. And the main trench there was, which was full of dead Brits. There's a quite famous photograph of the main trench at Spearncott, full of dead British soldiers, nearly all shot in the side of the head by Boers who had outflanked them. Then Buller thinks, oh, I don't know, I'll attack at Valkrantz. So he attacks at Valkrantz, but he's not really sure, and he gets quite a lot of guys killed, and then he retreats again. And then eventually he decides, he realizes the right way to do it, which is to capture a position on the British side of the Tugela River that then outflanks the Boer positions. But, you know, fourth time lucky, I guess. The same week that Colenso happens, his first defeat, where he loses the guns, and where Freddie Roberts, Lord Roberts' son, is killed. The same week, there is another British defeat at Stormberg by another idiot British general. And there's another one as well whose name escapes me at the moment. But there were 3 defeats in a week, basically. And it was called Black Week. And so all of this is going really badly. And eventually the Brits think, hang on, Buller's probably not the guy who should be in charge here. Buller was a great major, but he was a mediocre colonel and a really poor general. And funnily enough, my ex-wife's best friend was a relative of General Buller, Sir Redvers Buller, VC. But anyway, so they replaced Buller with Frederick Roberts. Now, there's all sorts of stuff about this that has to do with the rivalry between Wolseley's African Ring and Roberts's Indian Ring, which we'll talk about on another history stream. They were rivals in terms of being generals, and one of Wolsey's lot had mostly fought in Africa, whereas Roberts was an Indian general. He was very successful in the Second Afghan War, for example. But anyway, Roberts was made Commander-in-Chief of South Africa. He arrives in February, I think, in 1900. And by August, he had occupied Bloemfontein, which is the capital of the Orange Free State. He'd occupied Johannesburg, and he'd occupied Pretoria, and Pretoria was the capital of the Transvaal. And the Brits thought, well, we've won the war, because, you know, they've occupied the enemy's capitals. But of course, the Boers then launch a guerrilla campaign with their commandos, which carries on for the next 2 years, basically. And this is extremely frustrating for Chamberlain, as I'm sure Aaron's going to tell us in a minute. But it's very frustrating for Chamberlain. And the unfortunate thing is that when Roberts goes home, they leave his second in command in charge, who is Lord Kitchener, who of course was famous for his victory at Khartoum in the Sudan, Battle of Omdurman. And Kitchener just wants to get this war over with. He's been told he's going to become Commander-in-Chief India after the war, and that's a very prestigious position for a British soldier. And he just wants to finish this war, and he is willing to compromise with the Boers far more than Milner is. Milner recognizes that, you know, eventually Britain's going to win this war, and the Boers will have no choice but to surrender. And Milner wants to just carry on the war until the Boers have had enough. Whereas Kitchener is willing to compromise. And the Anglo-Boer War, and I lived in South Africa for 15 years, so I've got a special interest in this. I've been to a lot of the battlefields. I think it's you could realistically say that Britain won the Anglo-Boer War eventually, but we lost the peace because we did compromise. And what happens is the Boers, and I believe Arron will probably tell us this. I know Chamberlain didn't want to give the book. Chamberlain goes out to South Africa shortly after the war. It finishes in May 1902. Because increasing numbers of Boers, by the way, are signing up to fight with the Brits, and the Boer leaders realize this is the one thing they can't do. You can't have the people, the Afrikaners, being split. And so they decide, no, we're going to chuck in the towel now. But we're not. We're going to negotiate. And because Kitchener just wants the war to end so he can fuck off to India, the Brits give away better terms than the Boers should have got. And whilst people like Chamberlain want a period of direct rule for the Transvaal of the Orange Free State, which was renamed the Orange River Colony, by the way, this doesn't happen. And the Boers are given self-government pretty much straight away. The other reason this happens is the Liberals win an election not that long after the war. And this is the Liberal Party that Winston Churchill had defected to. And they give, and I think Winston Churchill was Under Secretary for the colonies at this stage. I know he slags off Natal because they fight a Zulu rebellion and he thinks they're too nasty to the Zulus. But anyway, the Orange River Colony and the Transvaal are given self-government very, very quickly after the war. And because the Liberals take over, there's no large-scale British immigration to South Africa. The Afrikaners remain a majority in the country. And it's not very long before they create the Union of South Africa, which I think was in 1910 or 1911.
Yeah,
but sorry, Arron?
1910.
Yeah, I thought it was 1910. But it's under Afrikaner domination. I mean, all right, Louis Botha and later on Jan Smuts are, although they were both big-time Boer commando leaders, they're pro-British, kind of. But South Africa is still basically an Afrikaner. The whole of South Africa becomes an Afrikaner nation, really.
That was the compromise. That was, well...
That was the compromise that Kitchener and other people were willing to make in order to finish the war. But it kind of made the war pointless because what Britain wanted to avoid was Afrikaner dominated South Africa. What they end up with is an Afrikaner dominated South Africa. But anyway, there we go.
Yeah. And the thing is that Afrikaners came. I mean, they did. They submitted under the crown, the Imperial crown, but they were able to dominate. That was the thing. They were able to dominate, and parts of the British colony. I mean, if you think about it, like the Cape Colony, not much presence. They did they had the Great Trek, and so they were able to reclaim parts that they haven't held on to until that point for some time.
Yeah, and one of the big things that's causing that enables that people like Kitchener to get their way, and the reason why Chamberlain eventually has to agree to it is because of the cost of the war. One of the things that people rarely ever mention about the British Empire is that the most important influential department in the British government when it comes to British expansion isn't the Colonial Office, isn't Number 10, it's the Treasury. And people will be shocked to learn that the Treasury doesn't like to spend money. And so they were constantly pressuring Chamberlain and the Colonial Office to to sort of bring the war to an end. And so, due to the combination of Kitchener and the Treasury, particularly the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, who interestingly had been the Colonial Secretary in the 1870s, where he would try to stop Henry Bartlett Frere from provoking the Zulu War. He essentially he's continually making the case to Salisbury and to Chamberlain, and they finally sort of both say, right, okay, yes, fine, as long as the Boers surrender unconditionally and agree to put that in wrong, we will come to a compromise with them. And so,
well, Britain even paid the Afrikaner republics. We paid their war debts.
Yeah,
the British taxpayer paid their war debts. They didn't. And yeah, the British Empire was absolutely ran on the cheap. It really was, and that was because of the Treasury. They thought you could be a world imperial power and spend no money. Basically.
Yeah. There were one thing I should mention at this point, something which becomes important for the tariff reform campaign that we're going to come on to shortly, is that throughout the war, Chamberlain, as sort of the public face of the war, is making this is an imperial war. He exhorts the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders to send troops to obviously South Africa, and they do in quite large numbers.
Yeah, 40,000 Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders fought in the Anglo-Boer War on the British side. 40,000 of them, and also large numbers of British descent South Africans also fought in the Boer War. But units like the Imperial Light Horse were all English-speaking South African guys.
Yeah, and so this is going to be the big thing that sort of dominates not just Chamberlain's career going from this point on, 1902 until 1906, but also the sort of government. So what happens is, as soon as the war ends, Lord Salisbury, who is not a well man, I think he's 70s at this point, and so
didn't he also he gave up the Foreign Office at some stage, Arron, I believe, because he'd always been his own foreign secretary, and then he had to go and treat his dying wife, I believe, as well.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he had. It was a combination of his health and the death of his wife. And interestingly, like Chamberlain, Salisbury had a very close relationship with his family, with his wife and his children. And so the loss of his wife was sort of took it out of him, and his own personal health problems. And that by May 1902, he is very much looking forward to resigning now. For Salisbury, his natural successor is his nephew, Arthur Balfour. For Chamberlain, Salisbury's natural successor is Balfour. But for some of Chamberlain's supporters, they think Chamberlain should be his successor. However, Chamberlain makes it quite clear, both in public and private, that Balfour is the man who should be the next Prime Minister. And so Salisbury resigns in July 1902, and Balfour becomes the Prime Minister. And Chamberlain decides, even though he could be offered any other post in the Balfour government, he says he's going to remain at the Colonial Office because he wants to continue his work on what will now become tariff reform and Imperial Federation. And however, even if Chamberlain had sort of had the idea that he could succeed Salisbury, I don't think it would have happened, because whilst he was the man of the Liberal Unionists, he wasn't necessarily seen as a conservative. And there was still an element of sort of distrust of Chamberlain's social reforming radicalism among the Tory backbenchers that would have stopped him from becoming Unionist Prime Minister. And we do have to remember that at this point it is still a coalition where the Tories are the majority and the Liberal Unionists are the minority. And the idea of Chamberlain, the leader of the minority party in the coalition, becoming Prime Minister is something that's highly unlikely. So to my view, even if Chamberlain wanted to become Prime Minister at this point, he wouldn't have been able to. But he actually didn't, and he was very much...
Yeah, he always said, I'll quite happily serve under Balfour. It has to be said, though, that Balfour, the divine Arthur, as he was known, was not as an effective a politician as Salisbury.
No, he was not. And this is actually shown in the way he handles the tariff reform situation, because Chamberlain, from 1895 up until 1902, has attended a couple of colonial conferences, and as has happened before, when he's met with colonial premiers and officials from the various colonies, from Canada, and now the United Australia and New Zealand, and from the Cape Colony and Atoll, they're all telling him, yes, we like the idea of Imperial Federation, but you need to get the tariffs out of the way first. And so by 1902, Chamberlain has come to firm view that...
Can we, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Arron, but just to make it clear to people what we're talking about, the tariff reform.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I smoke too much. Yeah, the Brits had always supported free trade, which made sense in the 1850s, for example, when British industry was much more efficient than everybody else's, because we started the Industrial Revolution before everybody else. Beg your pardon. And it made sense in those days. From about 1880, it didn't, because in some industries, Britain was being overtaken in efficiency by other countries. Only in some industries, by the way. For example, in shipbuilding, Britain was still supreme into the 1920s. But in other industries, there were increasing rivalries. And all other nations, that is to say the United States, France, Germany, Russia, you name it, they all had tariffs, which meant, forgive me, which meant if you were a British industry and you were trying to sell anything into these countries, you would have to pay a tariff. So your goods would have become relatively more expensive in that country. Whereas if, say, America or Germany or France or Russia or anyone was trying to sell something into Britain, there was no tariff. So your goods could be as cheap as a British product. And it also meant the same with agricultural stuff. So if you're looking at imperial tariff reform, the idea was that Australian and Canadian and New Zealand agricultural produce, for example, would have become relatively cheaper, which would have meant Britain would have bought more of it rather than buying it from America or Argentina. Talking about wheat or beef or anything you care to name, or lamb in the case of New Zealand. But also, same thing with industrial products from the colonies. So it would have made Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and also South African industry more competitive in Britain, while making German and American products less competitive. It was essential, basically. It was the quid pro quo that you needed to do to get Imperial Federation. There had to be something in it for the settler colonies.
Yeah.
But of course, it would have also gone the other way. It would have meant that British products would have been cheaper in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. So it would have worked in both directions, if you see what I mean. That was the whole point of imperial tariff reform.
Yeah, and so Chamberlain, after the Duke of Previously mentioned that he'd gone to South Africa, and he had, as I mentioned, come to the idea of Imperial Federation. He'd come around to tariff reform. But after he comes back to South Africa, he's completely committed to it. This is the future as far as he's concerned. And so he starts within the cabinet advocating for it. And he has some initial sort of initial ideas of hope, because Michael B. Hicks, who was the still Chancellor then, did, because of the cost of the Boer War, put on a levy on corn. And so Chamberlain see this as a first step for tariff reform. Unfortunately, this itself fundamentally doesn't go very far, because Hicks' speech is out not long afterwards, and he's replaced by Richard, who we previously mentioned, who had by this point become an ardent free trader. Now, there's one other thing that needs to be mentioned, which is slightly separate from tariff reform, about what's going on particularly within the Liberal Unionists, is that the government puts forward in 1902 an Education Act, which essentially goes against Chamberlain's previous sort of advocation for the schools being separate from the church, and this causes some dispute among Chamberlain's own supporters. And so when he enters into his big campaign for tariff reform, his base is not wholly behind him because of this division over the education. And it also undermines, particularly among voters, more necessarily than his activists, because as far as they're concerned, one of the things that they're advocating for is opposition to home rule, support for tariff reform, and support for non-sectarian education. And the Education Act 1902 sort of eviscerates that, and so that causes Chamberlain some difficulties. This is something to understand from what happens in 1906 in the general election, so we'll come back to that later. But anyway, so when the 1903 budget is put forward by Ritchie, he removes any sort of tariffs, and Ritchie makes it clear that this is a free trade budget, and Chamberlain reacts by resigning. He does so, and he makes it clear to Balfour that this is done so that he can very much campaign freely against the free trade budget, and also in favour of tariff reform. Now, Balfour does something which is frankly idiotic as a Prime Minister and as a party leader and as a leader of a coalition. He doesn't take a stand on tariff reform. If he had taken a stand for tariff reform or against it or in favour of free trade, he would have been in a better position, but he just refuses to do anything about it. He just keeps coming out mealy-mouthed answers, which makes nobody happy, and it just causes the division within the parliamentary party, the parliamentary Unionists.
Yeah, he sits on the fence, Arron, which is very much what Balfour generally did. But also, it's worth pointing out the vast majority of the Conservatives had, by this stage, come around to supporting tariff reform. And one of the things I didn't say when I was talking about what it meant, it's a way of protecting British industry and British jobs, and also the same thing in the settler colonies. The picture I've got up at the moment is from 1906, and it's celebrating Chamberlain being the MP for Birmingham between 1876 and 1906. And if you look at it, one side is British agriculture, and in the background you'll see the chimneys of British industry, and on the other, of course, is the Empire. And this is the stuff that Chamberlain was trying to support. Now, Churchill, of course, crosses the floor from the Conservative to the Liberal Party over this issue because he's a free trader. And the free traders lied, basically. They did. They just lied. And they said, oh, no, the price of bread will go up if we have imperial tariff reform, which was bullshit, actually. It was just bullshit. But anyway, they did. I'm sorry, Arron, I didn't mean to interrupt me.
Well, in terms of in terms of support within the Conservatives, what happens is in the country, i.e. the Conservative Association, they overwhelmingly come to support tariff reform, as do the overwhelming majority of the Liberal Unionists. In the House of Commons, though, the Conservatives, the split is a bit more even within the Conservatives. The Liberal Unionists are overwhelmingly coming over to it. And so this sort of cut is a canker at the heart of the Balfour government. The Balfour is just refusing to take a position. And when he finally does in 1905, he does it so sort of half-heartedly, he might as well not have even done anything at all. And Chamberlain is continuing to campaign for this, and this essentially leads to Balfour sort of gets fed up, and this is why he decides to resign as Prime Minister when he didn't need to. To explain for people, in terms of general elections in Britain at this point, because we were still under the Septennial Act of 1715, general elections were every 7 years. So Balfour didn't need to leave office until didn't need to call a general election until 1907. And he could have, the majority, the Unionists had a majority, but because he's so fed up, Balfour, I'm speaking about, with the situation over tariff reform, largely one of his own making, because if he'd taken a position either one way or the other, he would have been in a better position politically. But he's got himself into this idiotic position. Chamberlain has essentially converted both the Liberal Unionists and the Tories, at least out in the country, to the position of tariff reform. That Balfour just sort of resigns and let the Liberals in. And then the Liberals call the general election in early 1906. Now, this general election is bad for the Unionists in terms of their numbers, because they are reduced to 107 seats in the House of Commons. However, that reduction chucks out pretty much all the free traders. And so in the aftermath of the 1906 general election, you have a Unionist coalition which is overwhelmingly in favour of tariff reform. And whilst the Unionist coalition as a whole had been reduced, Chamberlain's core base in Birmingham and West Midlands actually increases. All their majorities increase in the 1906 general election. And the point is, and it leads to a point being made by Chamberlain's supporters, an entirely accurate one, that the Conservatives and the Unionists as a whole did not lose a single vote because of free trade. It was because of because of tariff reform or opposition to free trade. It was because they didn't take an official line on it, and that the people punishing them for that. And so
there was no real leadership from Balfour, as you've said several times, Arron. Absolutely.
And so, and also what happens is that not only do the Conservatives lose, the Unionists lose power, Balfour loses his seat, meaning that Chamberlain becomes effectively a leader of the opposition. And I think he could well have become overall leader of the Unionists at this point. But what happens at this point is that he suffers as he's celebrating his 70th birthday, he has a stroke, and it's complete. It sort of takes him out of things. He loses power of speech for some time. He eventually gets that back, but he speaks. He still has difficulty speaking. His mobility is reduced, and his son Austin very much becomes his cipher in the House of Commons. And he is, from 1906 up until his death in 1914, a pretty sort of pitiable figure. He is not. He ceases to be the sort of titan, sort of colossus striding British politics that he had been before his stroke. He never truly recovers from it. But he has many legacies. First of all, the political machine he created in Birmingham, which, as I mentioned near the start of this stream, continues as a powerhouse in Birmingham politics well into the 1940s. Austin Chamberlain, during this period, from 1906 to 1914, becomes a frontline politician. So much so that in 1911, when Balfour finally resigns, despite the fact that Austin Chamberlain is a Liberal Unionist, he is very definitely seen as a candidate for the Conservative leadership. And then that is sort of cemented by the fact that the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists unite in 1912, and eventually, after the First World War, Austin Chamberlain, though he never doesn't become Prime Minister, he does become leader of the Conservative Party for a time, and he is during the 20s and 30s Foreign Secretary and seen as sort of elder statesman of the Conservative Party, for whom younger Conservatives should model themselves on. And obviously, his younger half brother, Neville Chamberlain, becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister. And tariff reform remains a policy of the Conservative Party right up until the 1950s. So Chamberlain's legacy is a not insignificant one in terms of sort of British politics.
Also worth pointing out, it was Joseph Chamberlain who really founded Birmingham University as well.
Yes.
There's an enormous clock tower still there which commemorates him, and it's him who creates Birmingham University.
Yeah, and I actually, just with Chamberlain's legacy, I'd just like to quote from the book again. This is near the end, so this is it's actually going to be a line that people will almost certainly have heard of, but I don't think they'll know it actually came from this book. So this is how it begins. All political lies, unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, end in failure, because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. The career of Joseph Chamberlain was no exception. 3 times, once as if by anticipation in 1874, again in 1886, and again in 1905, he was the agent of defeat and even destruction to the political party in which he lived and worked. Each time, the cause for which was so seemed to him right and overwhelmingly important was not that he not wrecked or even positively desires. The action should be instrumental in the triumph of the opposite party. For the Liberal Party had betrayed radicalism, then Gladstone had betrayed the United Kingdom, and finally the Conservative Party had betrayed the Empire. His hand should be against betrayal, whatever the consequences. And I think that very much sums up Chamberlain's career.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree at all with that, Arron. I think that looking back on this with hindsight, as we can now, Chamberlain was right. If we'd have followed his path of Imperial Federation in the late 1890s, early 1900s, Britain would have been in an immeasurably stronger position later in the 20th century. I think that's undeniable.
Yeah, absolutely. He made and unmade sort of politics of the era, and he was, to my mind, as you say, Duke, on the right side of things.
William, what's your thoughts on his overall career? William, are you still with us, mate? William, you still around? He must be busy. William, I'm asking you for your final thoughts, but if you can't hear me, there's not much I can do about it. Yeah, look, guys, I'm aware there are things we didn't talk about in the Anglo-Boer War, etc. I'll do a stream on the Anglo-Boer War at some stage where we will go into all this shit. But this wasn't the place to do it. This is a kind of a political biography, I guess, which Arron has done really well. Like I said, I mean, the overwhelming thing to look at Chamberlain is that he was right. By the time, I think this is worth saying, I mean, as Arron said, tariff reform and all this stuff became cornerstones of the Conservative Party, but way too late. By the time this had happened, Britain had accepted things like the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which really, to me, the First World War and the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, that's when Britain goes from being, you can't really say one of the leading powers in the world, but it certainly takes Britain down quite a couple of pegs. Both in how rich we were. I mean, prior to 1914, Britain was still just about the richest country in the world. We were a creditor nation to nearly everybody, whereas by 1918 we owed the Americans money because the Americans were sensible and stayed out of World War I until towards the end. and just charged us loads of money, basically, which is what Britain should have done. Britain should have stayed out of it and charged the French and the Russians and even the Germans any amount of money for our goods. That would have been the sensible thing to do. That would have meant Britain didn't make the original sin of the British Empire, which was going to war in 1914, and then even more than that, raising a mass army against all British military divisions. But then you had the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, where Britain, which had a navy which was about twice the size of the Americans in 1921, Britain deliberately scrapped half our warships to make our navy as small as the Americans. And at the same time, we allowed our unrivaled shipbuilding industry to rot and die, basically. And even then, it was 1943 before the American Navy became bigger than the Royal Navy. But anyway, and that was after losses in World War II and also Churchill's idiot decisions while he was First Lord of the Admiralty and Prime Minister in 1940, 39 and 40. But Chamberlain was right. If we'd have followed his lead, or if the Conservative Party had followed his lead, I think we'd have done much better, frankly. I don't know if you have anything else to say on that.
All I would say is I would very much recommend this biography of Chamberlain by Enoch Powell. It's more of a biographical study than a full-dress biography, but it gives you a really good rundown of his career. There is also, I haven't read this, but I do want to read it at some point. There's a multi-volumed biography that was done by a man called Garvin, who was actually somebody who campaigned for Chamberlain during the Edwardian Union, and then also finished by Julian Amory, who was a sort of Tory politician after the Second World War, son of Joseph, son of Leo Amory, who actually got his start on the Chamberlain. And that, I would say, is from what I've heard, though, again, I haven't read it. I would recommend people read that as well, because that gives you the full dress biography of his life.
Absolutely. I'd say the other thing that's worth pointing out is that amongst liberal leftists, Chamberlain's not popular. Despite his early radicalism and all the stuff he did for British working guys, and he did a lot, as hopefully we've brought out a bit in this stream. Despite that, liberal leftists detest him because he was an imperialist.
Yeah, I'm sure people on our in this chat will have heard of the Pimlico Review. They recently did had an article published about the Fabian Society, which it's a hit and miss description of their history, but there is a remark there where clearly this person who's described themselves as pro-Fabian and pro-European treats Chamberlain as duplicitous and calls him all sorts of other things, which shows that sort of left-wing attitude towards Chamberlain is not they're not as you say, Duke, overly fond of him.
Yeah, which is one reason why I like him. Look, he did two things I don't like. I didn't agree with his support for the Entente with France, but then, like I said, I think that was the original sin of the British Empire, was joining World War I in 1940. Also, I didn't much like his so-called Uganda proposal. It really was about Kenya, by the way, not Uganda. It was just that Chamberlain happened to be on a train in Uganda when he saw some country. And this was a proposal that to give the Zionists a homeland in Africa. Probably would have been better than giving them Israel, but anyway, who knows? I'm not gonna get into that today. We have a big Israeli war going on at the moment, which is people say it's an American war. I'd say it's an Israeli war, and they drag the Americans into it, but whatever. And apparently Nigel Farage wants to get involved in it. Well, that tells you what you need to know about Nigel Farage, really. I'm in favour of Britain being able to defend the Crown bases in Cyprus. Like, I'd fully support sending a British destroyer there to intercept enemy drones. Don't want to get involved in the war, not at all. Why would fighting Iran do any good for Britain? The reason I like people like Chamberlain and like Salisbury, who is Arron Hook's avatar, by the way, is that they always look at every issue from the point of view of what is best for Britain, not for somebody else. So yeah. Arron, would you like to plug your channel, sir?
Yes, my channel is Arron James Hook. I do a lot of book reviews, also sometimes film reviews. And this Saturday, I will actually be doing a live stream with my friend DK, who is usually in the chat of these live streams, where we'll be giving our. I run a book club, and the favorite pick was Cinderella by Imperial, so we'll be discussing that on Saturday's live stream. That is at noon British time, and it usually goes for about an hour.
Yeah, I can say I've done a few streams with Arron on his channel. Arron's channel's well worth following, particularly if you're into books or sometimes films, as Arron says. But yeah, well worth following Arron Hook's channel. And on my Discord, Arron is the #1 person I go to when I want to talk about 19th and early 20th century British politics. Arron knows way more about that than I do. Are you back with us, William Grenville? I know William works pretty hard and he occasionally falls asleep. He might have fallen asleep. But anyway, thank you for joining us, William. William's also got a good YouTube channel, and I will put a link to that, as well as Arron Hook's channel, in the description later on. Thank you very much for coming on, Arron. Couldn't have done this stream without you, mate. I think we covered Joseph Chamberlain pretty well, to be honest. Certainly one of my heroes for the most part, my political heroes, and I don't have many of them. I have very little room for most British politicians, as you probably will have realised, particularly when I'm talking about people like Gladstone, for example, who I have no time for whatsoever. But anyway, yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. Let me just check if we got any super chats. I don't suppose we did. Nope, we didn't. We don't usually on history streams because we get less people watching the history streams, sadly. But yeah, that was pretty interesting. I'm not sure what we're doing next week, to be honest. I would also say later on this week, I think, our friend Mitch is doing a stream. Mitch has just started a YouTube channel, and his first one is going to be about General Stonewall Jackson, the American Civil War commander, which I think will be interesting. And so, yeah, go and check out Mitch. There he is. Go and check him out. I'll be interested in that one because I like Stonewall Jackson. I think he was a very good general. All right, guys. Thanks very much for joining us. Hopefully you found that interesting and learned a few things. I will do an Anglo-Boer War stream at some point. In fact, I'm going to have to do a first Anglo-Boer War stream at some point, which is going to make me very sad because it didn't go well for the Brits, and Gladstone managed to make it even worse. But we'll do that at some point. Mitch is saying his stream is tomorrow night, so go and check out Mitch. I will put a link up to Mitch's stream somewhere. It's in my Discord, but I'll put it up somewhere, probably on my posts thing on YouTube, so people can find it. But yeah, thank you again to Arron Hook. Thank you also to William. What do you call yourself these days? William Grenville. Thank you again to William Grenville. and to Arron Hook, and we will see you on Saturday for our normal current affairs and politics stream. And who knows what we'll be talking about on that one. And in the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down.